On a warm July evening in 1864, a respectable London clerk stepped down from a North London railway train near Hackney, clutching a walking stick, the gold watch chain swinging loose at his waist where the watch itself had gone missing. He was covered in blood. His name was Thomas Briggs, and he would die in his own bed that same night, becoming the first person ever murdered on a British railway. The whole country reeled. The railways were the proud modern wonder of Victorian England, gleaming engines of progress. And here was a 69-year-old banker bludgeoned to death in a first-class carriage, on the way home from dinner with his niece. A young German tailor named Franz Müller would hang for the crime the following autumn before an enormous, shouting crowd at Newgate Prison. But the real and lasting aftershock of the Briggs murder was stranger still. Suddenly all the elaborate and invisible rules of Victorian social life were exposed, as brittle. You sat in a private compartment with strangers. You did not speak to them. You certainly did not look them too directly in the face. Etiquette had kept everyone safe, or so people had believed. Now etiquette alone was plainly not enough. Railway carriages began to install communication cords. Ladies were advised to travel only with their husbands or a stout male relative. New rules were drafted to fix the gap, because the Victorians believed, with a faith almost religious, that correct behaviour could tame the chaos of the modern age. And that is where tonight's journey begins. Not with the murder, thankfully, because we are not going to dwell on poor Mr. Briggs any further than he deserves, which is politely and briefly. We are going to begin with all those rules. Rules about calling cards and mourning veils, rules about whether you might refer to a piece of furniture's leg as leg in mixed company, rules about exactly how long a widow must wear black crape over her face, and rules about which flowers you were permitted to send a young lady, if you wished, very discreetly, to suggest you might. Perhaps one day, after many more chaperone teas, consider possibly proposing marriage. The Victorians wrapped their world in a soft-wound bandage of propriety, and they trusted the bandage to hold civilization together. They were often wonderfully earnest about it. They were sometimes slightly ridiculous. They were occasionally charming and occasionally honestly exhausting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, I would love to know where you are right now. Post your location and your local time in the comments. I find it rather lovely to imagine listeners scattered around the globe. Some of you in snug bedrooms in Dublin, some of you driving home on long American highways, some of you awake at 3 a.m. in Tokyo, kindly letting me talk at you until you drift off. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine then that you are stepping down from a hansom cab in Belgravia, London, on a pale spring morning in 1878. The horse stamps once on the wet cobblestones. The cabman, coat dripping, touches his brim in the elaborately respectful way Victorian cabmen were expected to, and you hand him his shilling plus an extra twopence for the courtesy. You straighten your gloves. You check your pocket, or your reticule, to be certain you have brought the most important object of the morning. Not money, not a letter. A small silver case containing your calling cards, printed in engraved copper plate on thick, cream-coloured pasteboard with your name in careful script and nothing else beside it. You're about to perform a ritual that we now find faintly bewildering, and that every well-born Victorian understood in their bones. Calling. The social visit. The 3 to 5 o'clock sacrament of the 19th century middle and upper classes. You walk up the scrubbed white steps of a stucco-fronted townhouse. The door is opened by a footman in a plum-coloured coat, powdered at the temples in the older style, because this particular house still employs staff trained under a Regency butler, and the butler considers hair powder to be proper dress for the front door. You do not really speak to the footman. He does not quite speak to you. Instead, you produce one of your cards, and depending on whom you hope to see, you turn up one corner of the card to indicate that you have called in person rather than sending it by a servant, and you turn up another corner if you wish to call on the lady of the house specifically. Every creased corner carried meaning. Get it wrong and you had, without saying a word, implied something quietly impolite. Historians still argue whether these corner folds were genuinely universal across Victorian London, or whether they were one of those rules that etiquette manuals printed largely, in order to sell more copies of etiquette manuals. My own favourite theory is the second one, because Victorian publishers had a marvellous talent for inventing rules and then shaming everyone into obeying them. The footman vanishes. You wait in a small hallway smelling faintly of beeswax and hothouse violets. A tall clock ticks somewhere behind a velvet curtain. You can hear the distant clatter of the kitchen deep beneath you, and the slow thud of a heavy parlour door closing. Then the footman returns, carrying the silver salver, with one of 3 possible answers. each of which is understood by everyone present without needing to be spelled. Quote, if the lady of the house is not at home, it may mean exactly that, or it may mean that she is very much at home. In the drawing room, perhaps drinking tea, perhaps painting a watercolour of a pug, but has decided that today is not your day. You take no offence. You leave your card on the silver salver in the hallway. That card, the fact of your having called, is itself the social act. You have ticked a box. You have performed your duty. You may now leave, pleased and slightly insulted simultaneously, which, as it turns out, was a very Victorian emotional state indeed. If, however, the footman returns and says the mistress of the house will receive you, then a different protocol begins to unfold, and you must be ready. You are shown upstairs to the drawing room, where a maid has already drawn back the thick brocade curtains, a careful inch or two, letting in exactly the polite amount of April light, because too much sunshine will fade the silk on the sofa, and too little will suggest the family is ashamed of its furniture. The lady of the house rises very slightly when you enter. She does not stand all the way up, unless you're a clergyman or a duchess. Half rise, the barest lifting of the lap, is the precise greeting due to a respectable caller of roughly equal rank. You bow, she inclines her head. Nobody shakes hands because handshaking was a custom Victorians considered a touch too continental, touch too hearty, and reserved mostly for introductions at evening parties or for certain Americans who could not be dissuaded. You sit. You keep your hat on your knee if you're a gentleman, because leaving it on a hall table implies you intend to stay longer than the permitted 15 to 20 minutes, and leaving it on the floor implies you have been raised by wolves. You keep your gloves on, both of them, because removing gloves during a formal call would suggest you were preparing to eat something, and you're absolutely not going to be offered anything to eat. You may, if you are lucky, be offered a small cup of weak tea, which you must accept but must not actually drink with any enthusiasm. The tea is ornamental. The tea is a prop. The tea is the social equivalent of a handshake, acknowledging the encounter without committing to it. Conversation is shallow on purpose. The weather, a mutual acquaintance's minor illness, the newest exhibition at the Royal Academy, the very recent engagement of a cousin, these were the acceptable subjects. Politics, religion, money, and anything too personal were all firmly off the table, and so was the table itself, in a sense, because you were not to refer to any furniture by its anatomical parts. A leg was a limb. A breast of chicken, should it somehow come up, was white meat. Historians still argue whether Victorians genuinely covered their piano legs with little pantalettes to avoid scandal, or whether this was an American satirical invention later adopted by the British as a joke against themselves. My gentle, unhistorical opinion is that somebody somewhere did it once, entirely sincerely, and then a journalist wrote about it, and then all of polite society laughed nervously and pretended they had always been doing it too, which is a very modern kind of dynamic once you think about it. After 15 minutes of this carefully choreographed nothingness, you glance at the mantel clock, murmur that you must not keep your hostess, and rise. She rises. You do not, under any circumstances, kiss her hand because this is England, and hand-kissing is for novels about the continent. You bow. You retreat. You do not turn your back on her until you have reached the doorway. A little backward shuffle is executed, with just enough grace that it does not look like a backward shuffle. The footman is waiting with your umbrella. You descend the steps. You tick this house off the mental list of obligations you owe today, and you move on to the next, where you will perform the same ritual again, possibly with slightly stronger tea. A well-connected Victorian lady might pay 20 such calls in a single week. That is a lot of tepid conversations about the weather, and yet nobody, at least in the diaries we have from the period, seemed to find it absurd. Calling was how your social universe stayed in equilibrium. To neglect a call was to risk causing offence. To overcall was to seem needy. To call at the wrong time of day was to be considered common. Each city had its own unwritten rules. In London, mornings meant visits paid before luncheon, which is to say roughly between noon and 3. In Edinburgh, the hour of calling drifted later. In country houses, calls merged into tea and became longer and less formal, but the principle everywhere was the same. Your name on a card left on a salver was a tiny ambassador. The card did the work of your presence, and your presence was, if anything, slightly optional. There is a particularly charming piece of etiquette advice in a manual published in 1872, written for young men who had recently come up to town from the provinces. The author, an anonymous gentleman styling himself simply a man of the world, warns the reader not to leave more than 3 cards at any one, address on any one occasion, because to leave 4 is vulgar and to leave 5 is to behave like a foreigner. He also warns against walking into a drawing room with damp shoes, because nothing is more ruinous to a first impression than the smell of wet leather mingling with the hostess's potpourri. I find that particular observation delightful. It is the kind of detail that makes you feel for a moment that the Victorians were not a solid block of seriousness, but thousands of individual, slightly embarrassed human beings trying very hard to get things right, and sometimes arriving at a lovely house in Belgravia with soggy boots and a quietly panicked heart. Somewhere in a ledger in a house in Mayfair, there is probably still a calling card from 1873 with the upper left. Corner bent, lying undisturbed between the pages of an old book, waiting politely for somebody to notice it has been there all this time. That is the quiet, slightly melancholy magic of Victorian rules. They leave objects behind. Now let us move from the drawing room to a place even more tightly bound by regulation than the calling hour, and that is the world of Victorian mourning. If the calling card was the small change of 19th century social life, mourning dress was its imperial coinage. Nothing mattered more. Nothing was more elaborately prescribed. You are standing in your imagination in the front parlour of a middle-class home in Islington on a grey afternoon in December 1862. A man has died in this house. Perhaps he is a merchant, perhaps a bank clerk, perhaps an uncle who came to stay last summer and never quite recovered from the cold he caught on the train. He lies upstairs in a room with the shutters closed and a black cloth over the mirror. You are the widow or the daughter or the sister. Within hours of the death, the house has transformed around you. The front door has been hung with a wreath of black crape. The knocker has been tied with black ribbon so that visitors will not bang it and disturb the peace of the dead. The windows of the parlour have been shrouded with dark curtains. The clocks, by tradition in some households, have been stopped at the hour of death. The looking glasses have been covered with fabric, because a superstition half remembered and half believed held that a soul could be trapped in a reflection. Queen Victoria, of course, is the reason so much of this became so rigid. Her husband, Prince Albert, died on the 14th of December in 1861 at Windsor Castle of what was probably typhoid fever, though historians still argue whether it was typhoid or something else. Perhaps Crohn's disease, perhaps simply overwork. The Queen, on hearing that he was truly gone, was said to have walked into his dressing room, closed the door and sat for a very long time with one of his shirts pressed to her face. She then ordered that his belongings be left exactly as he had arranged. Then, hot water was to be brought to his dressing room every morning, as though he would come and shave. Fresh flowers were to be placed by his bed each evening. His clothes were laid out in their customary order. For the next 40 years, until her own death in 1901, the Queen wore black. Not occasionally, not mostly. Black, all of it. Every day. She wore a widow's cap trimmed with white lace. She rarely appeared in public for 3 years after Albert's death, and when she did, she appeared veiled. The country, grieving too, and also eager to imitate its monarch, took her lead. Mourning became national. It became an industry. Whole streets of London, particularly Regent Street and Oxford Street, had shops devoted to the strange and specialised commerce of grief. Jay's London General Mourning Warehouse, which opened on Regent Street in 1841 and was already flourishing, expanded to enormous size. Jay's employed hundreds of people and stocked, at any moment, mourning gowns in dozens of stages of dollar, from deepest crepe black to faintest lavender, and every shade of grey, mauve and purple in between. You could walk into Jay's the day after a death in the family, and walk out 2 hours later with an entire new wardrobe. A black-edged handkerchief, black stationery, black-bordered calling cards, and a little bottle of black pins, because even your brooches and buttons were expected to conform. Crepe was the key material. This was a stiff, crimped silk fabric, dyed with a logwood dye that smelt faintly of must, and sometimes ran in the rain, staining your hands and face a strange blackish green that made you look, briefly, like someone pretending to be a ghost in a village play. Widows were expected to wear full mourning, which included crepe covering every visible surface of their outer garments, for a year and a day. After that, they moved into second mourning, in which crepe was still worn, but could be reduced, and black silks and wools came in. Then came ordinary mourning, in which shiny black fabrics were permitted, followed by half mourning, in which grey, mauve and lilac became acceptable. The full cycle for a widow was 2.5 years. For a parent it was a year. For a sibling, 6 months. For an aunt or uncle, 3 months. For an aunt-in-law, 6 weeks, which feels somehow both precise and begrudging, like a hotel cancellation policy. Men's mourning was much briefer, which will surprise exactly nobody. A widower was expected to wear a black armband or black crepe on his hat, and sombre clothes generally. For a year, although a widower was also expected to be entirely free, to remarry the moment he felt ready, which was often remarkably soon. Diaries and letters from the period are full of women expressing astonishment, quietly, at the speed with which a neighbour's husband found himself a new wife, while the widows next door were still 2 full years deep in black. There is a dry anecdote in a memoir published in 1887 of a widower who married his wife's own sister within 11 months of the funeral, saying simply that the children needed a mother and his sister-in-law needed a home, which is a perfect Victorian sentence because it is both practical and a little heart-stopping. Historians still argue whether the speed of male remarriage was cynical or kind. Probably both. The answer tonight, in the warm, soft lamplight of your bedroom, is that it was likely mostly tired. Victorians worked. They grieved while they worked. They kept moving because if they stopped, the house would not run, the shop would not open, and the children would not be fed. Ritual held them up as much as it weighed them down. It was a corset for the soul, you might say, and now we're already, as promised, talking about corsets. Before we reach the corset, though, which truly deserves its own long and slightly wheezing section, let us linger a moment more in the Mourning household, because the rules reached further than clothes. The widow in her darkened parlour was expected to keep away from public entertainments for the first year, no theatre, no concerts, no dinner parties beyond the most muted family gatherings. She did not attend weddings, except in deepest black, which was considered unlucky anyway, so she usually did not attend at all. She did not dance, even at home, even for a niece's birthday. She wrote her letters on paper bordered with a thick black margin, which grew gradually narrower as the months of mourning passed, a quiet calendar printed along every envelope. When her first year was up, the border would shrink to a thinner black line, and her friends reading their post would know, without her having to say a word, that she had moved into second mourning and could now accept an invitation to a small, quiet afternoon tea. Jewellery, of course, had its own rigid code. Full mourning permitted only jet, which is a form of fossilised driftwood from the Yorkshire coast, mostly mined around Whitby, where an entire local industry sprang up polishing the stuff into beads, earrings, brooches, bracelets, and enormous mournful necklaces that clicked softly when their wearers moved. Jet was matte, dark, and felt strangely warm to the touch. Because it was organic, unlike diamonds or pearls, it absorbed heat from your skin. Victorian widows, grieving in their black silk and black bombazine, would hold their jet beads between their fingers the way later generations would, twist wedding rings or worry at rosaries. Historians still argue whether the sudden huge fashion for jet was genuinely about grief or about the Queen's lifelong patronage of Whitby, but Whitby certainly did well out of it. By the 1870s, the town had more than 200 jet workshops, and a polished jet cross on a black silk ribbon was considered the essential token of bereavement from a respectable shop. Then there were the mourning photographs. You may have heard of these, and they do sound grim, but in their time they were tender things. A photographer would be called to the house, sometimes within the same day as the death, and would arrange the deceased, dressed in their Sunday best, in a chair or a bed, with their eyes usually closed but sometimes painted open onto the finished photograph. In a gesture of hopeful tenderness, children were sometimes photographed in their mother's arms, stone still, and the mother would be staring into the camera, trying very hard not to move. Exposures took 30 seconds or more. A living person breathing would appear slightly blurred. A dead person, held perfectly still, would come out sharp. If you look at a family photograph from the 1860s and notice that one member of the family seems curiously more in focus than the others, that sometimes tells you something, it is not creepy once you know why. It is, in fact, heartbreaking. For many families, that post-mortem image was the only photograph they would ever possess of the loved one. Cameras were expensive. Sittings were rare. A child might live 7 years and never be photographed, and then die of scarlet fever. And the post-mortem picture was the only face left to keep. Hair jewellery was another great Victorian custom of mourning, and this is one of the quieter strangenesses of the age. When a person died, or sometimes simply went abroad for a long time, a lock of their hair would be cut carefully and sent to a specialist jeweller. The jeweller, working with tiny curved tools, would weave the hair into intricate little patterns, sometimes flowers, sometimes wheat sheaves, sometimes weeping willows. These patterns were then set behind glass in brooches, lockets, rings and bracelets. A widow might wear a brooch containing a curl of her dead husband's hair. A mother might wear a locket made of her lost child's hair. A friend might exchange a ring braided from 2 entwined locks, one blonde and one darker, as a keepsake of a lifelong friendship. It is not macabre. It is at its heart an attempt to carry the beloved person physically upon the body. When you think about it that way, Victorian hair bracelet is not very different from us today choosing a particular scent that reminds us of someone we have lost, only woven instead of sprayed. Funeral processions were elaborate too, but mostly among the middle and upper classes. The working poor had very different rituals. A pauper's funeral was small, hasty, and sometimes shared, but for a well-off family, a Victorian funeral was its own slow parade. Black-draped horses with black plumes on their heads pulled a hearse shaped like glass carriage. Mutes walked in front, their faces painted a ghostly white, carrying tall staves wrapped in black crape. They looked, if you want a gentle modern comparison, a little like Dickens characters who had wandered out of their book and were trying to find their way home. Mutes were often paid a small fee and half a bottle of gin, which explains a great deal about Victorian photographs of them leaning at strange angles. After the burial, the family returned to the house, where a heavy cold luncheon had been laid out by servants hired for the occasion. Nobody laughed. Nobody drank much, but somebody quietly at the back would eventually tell a gentle story about the person who had died, and people would smile, and the room would become, by degrees, warmer. A well-managed funeral ended in quiet relief. You had done the right thing. You had worn the right things. You had spoken the right words. And when the last mourner left and the front door closed, you could, at last, sit by the fire with your hair unpinned and weep in private, because the Victorian rulebook, for all its weight, had carefully built in a moment at the end where you were permitted, finally to feel, from the soft gloom of the morning parlour, drift with me into a much louder room. We are now in a dressmaker's shop on Bond Street, London, on an autumn afternoon in 1883. The shop has a bell above the door that jingles when you enter, and the air smells of new wool and very faintly of gaslight, because the bigger Bond Street establishments have been installing gas chandeliers for several years now. You are here because you need a new dress. A walking dress. Not a morning dress, which is what you would wear before luncheon at home. Not a carriage dress, which is different again, because you wear that when you are being driven anywhere formal. Not a dinner dress, which comes out after 7 in the evening, and certainly not an evening dress, which is cut lower, more elaborate and strictly for balls, concerts or the opera. A walking dress, for walking, in public, in daylight, with a gentleman acquaintance possibly, if he has been introduced to you properly, and this is before we even get to the question of the corset, beneath all of it, which we will, patiently, reach. A respectable Victorian lady of the 1880s might own, or hope to own, as many as 8 different categories of dress. There was morning dress, sometimes called a wrapper at home, loose and comfortable, worn only before callers arrived. There was a simple house dress for the afternoon, worn if you were staying in and not expecting company. There was a visiting or calling dress for paying those afternoon calls we just visited. There was a walking dress for strolls in the park. There was a carriage dress. There was a travelling costume for railway journeys, usually in dull, hard-wearing colours because railway carriages were full of coal dust. There was a dinner dress, and there was an evening dress, sometimes with multiple variations for different levels of formality. Young unmarried women wore lighter colours, such as pale blues, whites, creams, and soft greens. Married women had more freedom with darker, richer tones and bolder patterns. Widows, as we have seen, wore black. Older unmarried women, whom society rather uncharitably called old maids, were expected to retreat into muted greys, lavenders and quiet browns, as though preparing themselves in advance for the mourning they would one day have to wear for their parents. It was a kind of wardrobe autobiography. A stranger glancing across a drawing room could tell, at a single look, whether you were a girl out in her first season, a young wife, a matron with grown children, a widow in second mourning, or an elderly maiden aunt. The dress spoke for you before you opened your mouth, and in a society that frowned on women opening their mouths too often, that was no small convenience. The fabrics themselves had their own deep hierarchy. Silks, velvets, and cashmeres were for the wealthy. Merino, alpaca, and good wool for the comfortable middle class. Printed cottons, linens, and cheap mixed weaves for the working poor. A servant could not, without being judged, wear silk, because silk was understood as the privilege of those who did not fetch calls, but a servant could, and often did, wear hand-me-down silks from her mistress once the original owner had tired of them, and clever maids re-dyed and retrimmed these gowns for wear on their rare afternoons out. A Sunday afternoon walk by a parlour-maid in a 5-year-old silk dress that had once belonged to her mistress was an act of gentle, private defiance that absolutely nobody commented on, because commenting would have required admitting how the dress had arrived in her possession. Colours themselves had meaning. The 1860s saw the rise of those astonishing new aniline dyes, invented by a young chemist called William Henry Perkin, who in 1856, at only 18 years old, accidentally produced the first synthetic mauve while trying to make quinine. The colour was christened mauvine, and briefly mauve became a craze. Queen Victoria herself wore a mauve gown to her daughter's wedding in 1858, and Punch magazine complained the following year of a mauve measles sweeping the nation. After mauve came synthetic magenta, then fuchsia, then the brilliant Prussian greens that would later be linked, accurately, to arsenic-based dyes that made factory workers ill and probably slowly poisoned many of the women who wore them. Historians still argue whether green gown deaths from arsenic were as widespread as some. Victorian newspapers claimed that they certainly happened, and a green girl in a ballroom, admired across a crowded floor, was sometimes quite literally glowing with low-grade toxicity. Hats deserve their own little detour. The bonnet of the early Victorian years, tied under the chin with broad ribbons, gave way by the 1870s to smaller, puckier affairs perched on top of elaborate hairstyles, and by the 1880s to the wide-brimmed and heavily decorated picture hats that look to our modern eye almost comically overloaded with silk flowers, feathers, lace, and sometimes whole stuffed birds. There was, unfortunately, a craze in the 1880s and 1890s for dead hummingbirds, and even tiny taxidermied sparrows as hat decorations, which caused sufficient outrage among bird-loving Britons that a group of women founded the Society for the Protection of Birds in 1889, largely in protest at the hat industry. That society still exists today as the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, one of the largest wildlife charities in the world. So the next time you see an RSPB logo on a road sign, remember that its very first campaign was a polite Victorian ladies' society telling the hat makers of London, enough with the kingfishers, please, and beneath every dress, from the humblest cotton to the grandest silk, there was the corset. Now finally we can talk about it, and we will take our time, because the corset is the single most misunderstood garment in Western history, and a great deal of what we think we know about it is, frankly, nonsense. A Victorian corset was, most of the time, not a torture device. Let us begin there, because Hollywood and popular history have convinced most of us that every Victorian woman was laced half-conscious into a 16-inch waist before breakfast, and this is simply not what the diaries, the letters, the tailoring records, or the surviving garments suggest. The average Victorian woman of the middling classes wore a corset to support her back, to hold up her many layers of petticoats and skirts, and to shape her waist by perhaps 2 or 3 inches, which she considered comfortable and ordinary. Working women wore sturdier, shorter stays that were closer to what we would now call a practical back support. Corsets in the 1860s were cut long, came up over the bust, and were fastened at the front with a metal busk that hooked together, which was a revolutionary convenience because earlier women had needed help to lace themselves every morning. The busk meant a woman could dress herself without a maid, which explains why every middle-class Victorian had an opinion about the busk, and why it became a common gift from husbands to new wives, sometimes engraved with tiny lines of poetry. That said, the myth of tight lacing has some truth at its heart. There absolutely were women, mostly young, mostly fashion-conscious, mostly urban, mostly without the money for real freedom of movement, who laced themselves far tighter than was healthy. Magazines of the 1860s and 1870s are full of letters, some real and some probably invented by bored editors, from readers claiming to have waists of 17 or even 15 inches. Historians still argue whether those waists were genuine or whether the letters were what we would now call sponsored content for the corset makers, since magazines of the day were heavily supported by advertisements from the very shops that sold the tightest corsets, the most famous of these publications. The Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine ran a long-running correspondence section on tight lacing that sometimes read like erotic fiction, pretending to be moral concern, which tells you everything you need to know about Victorian publishing. Doctors did complain. By the 1870s, the medical profession was warning against extreme lacing, and articles appeared in the Lancet describing deformed ribs, displaced internal organs, and fainting young ladies. Yet the fainting stereotype itself deserves a little correction. Victorian women fainted less because their corsets were too tight and more because their rooms were overheated. Their dresses weighed up to 30 pounds. They ate very little, and they often did not go outdoors for hours at a time. Add to this the occasional over-tight lacing, and you have a formula for a delicate lady slumping onto a convenient chaise longue. The fainting couch, that long low sofa we associate with drawing rooms, was not designed for women collapsing from corsets. It was designed for reclining during the afternoon rest, which was a normal and advised practice for fashionable women. But myth and marketing together turned it into the fainting couch, and so it stayed. Petticoats were worn over the corset in many layers. In the 1850s, a woman might wear 4 or 5 petticoats, starched and stiffened to support the enormous bell-shaped skirts of the period. Then came the crinoline, invented in 1856, which was essentially a cage of thin steel hoops attached to fabric, tied at the waist, and worn underneath the skirts. The crinoline was a revolution. It removed the need for all those heavy layered petticoats. It allowed skirts to billow out to astonishing widths, sometimes 6 feet across at the hem, without the wearer being buried under cotton. And it also set women on fire, literally, with alarming frequency. In 1863 alone, the journal The Lancet estimated that over 3,000 women in England had died from crinoline-related accidents in a single year, either from catching their skirts on an open fire, candle or a gas jet, or from tripping down a staircase while unable to see their own feet. There are newspapers from that decade reporting several crinoline deaths in a single week. You began to see firemen in London carrying dampened blankets specifically in case a lady in crinoline caught a light in the street. The crinoline was replaced, by the late 1860s, with the bustle, which pushed the volume to the back rather than all around. Bustle was basically a wire cage or a padded horsehair pillow tied over the buttocks to create a shelf of fabric behind. Ladies in the full bustle years of around 1870, and again in the mid-1880s, walked around with what looked, from certain angles, like a small sofa cushion strapped to their rear. Caricaturists had a glorious time with this. Cartoons showed ladies using their bustles as tables for teacups, as extra seating for small dogs, as temporary shelves at picture galleries. There is a genuine Punch cartoon from 1885 showing a young husband secretly using his wife's bustle as a hiding place for a surprise birthday present, which is either charming or faintly alarming depending on how you read it. Drawers, or what we would call underwear today, were worn under everything. Victorian drawers were split at the crotch, meaning they had 2 separate legs that met at the waistband but did not join in the middle. This sounds startling to us, and a little ribald, but the reason was purely practical. Women wore so many layers that unfastening your way to a chamber pot or a water closet in a hurry would have been almost impossible. Split drawers made the practicalities of bodily existence manageable beneath all the silk and bone. The drawers were decorated, sometimes elaborately, with tucks, lace, and tiny embroidered flowers. Many survive in museum collections, and they are often far more beautiful than their wearers ever expected anyone else to see. There is something quietly touching about a pair of lace-edged Victorian drawers, made for one woman, sewn by her own hand, laundered and folded and tucked into a drawer in a bedroom in Sheffield or Southampton, never intended as fashion, only as ordinary dignity. Now let us slow the day down and sit at a Victorian dining table, because dinner in a middle-class household was a surprisingly strict performance, and the rules that governed it were so many and so detailed that etiquette books gave the dining room its own separate chapters. You are, let us say, a guest at a dinner party in a respectable household in Clifton, near Bristol in 1875. There are 14 people in the drawing room, sipping a single glass of sherry each, because that is how Victorian dinners began. The hostess has arranged the guests already in her head. She knows who will walk into the dining room on whose arm. She knows where each person will sit, and she has written out, in her careful handwriting, a little place card for each seat. A gentleman is assigned to a lady. He offers her his arm. They process into the dining room in order of precedence, with the highest-ranking pair going first, and the lowest trailing politely at the back. Precedence in Victorian dining was a problem more complicated than it sounds. A duke outranked a duchess of a lower duke. A bishop ranked below an earl but above a lesser baron. The wife of a very eminent doctor might rank above a lesser baronet's sister. There were entire reference books published to help country hostesses work out seating, plans without giving offence, and whole weekend house parties could be subtly ruined by mistake. There is a famous anecdote from the 1880s of a country hostess who accidentally placed a visiting earl below a wealthy but untitled industrialist because she had not realised the earl was travelling quietly under a courtesy title, and the earl spent the entire dinner politely unwilling to meet her eye, after which he left for London on the early train and never accepted an invitation from that house again. Historians still argue whether this story is true or simply the kind of anecdote that Victorian society told itself to keep hostesses on their toes, but it captures the anxiety of a properly run dinner. Once seated, the meal began with soup. You were served from the left by a footman or a parlour-maid in white gloves, and you ate from the side of the spoon, tilting it away from yourself. You did not slurp, you did not speak with your mouth full, you did not, under any circumstances, blow on hot soup, because blowing on food was a sign of poor upbringing. If the soup was too hot, You waited, watching the room as if you found the wallpaper fascinating, until it cooled enough to sip. A Victorian dinner of 14 courses was not unusual at the grander houses. It might begin with 2 soups, one clear and one thick, from which the diner chose. Then fish, usually served twice, once in a light sauce and once in a richer one. Then an entree, which was a small, intricate dish such as sweetbreads or quenelles of chicken. Then a releve, which was a bigger piece of meat with vegetables. Then a sorbet, a palate cleanser. Then the roast, usually game or a joint. Then a vegetable course on its own. Then a savoury, which might be devilled kidneys or a Scotch woodcock, which despite the name is not a bird but cheese on toast with anchovy. Then pudding, then fruit, then finally biscuits and nuts, with a glass of port passed only to the left, never to the right, because passing it the other way was unlucky, a small superstition that survived from the Royal Navy and crept quietly into the dining rooms of dryland civilians. Cutlery was the battleground. A Victorian place setting could include as many as 12 separate utensils, laid out from the outside in, so the rule was always to begin at the outermost piece and work inwards. Fish knives and forks, soup spoons, dessert forks, cheese knives, fruit knives with pearl handles, and tiny coffee spoons no bigger than an infant's thumb. To pick up the wrong implement was a minor embarrassment. To use your dessert fork for the fish was a story that could follow you for years. There is a genuine anecdote, recorded in the diary of an American visitor, about an English country weekend where a young man used his oyster fork for his salad and was gently corrected by his neighbour. And by the end of the week he had proposed to that neighbour, because nothing says romance quite like being saved from embarrassment at the dining table by someone who was tactful enough to whisper. Conversation at dinner was expected to go, for the first half of the meal, to the lady on your right, and for the second half, to the lady on your left. This was called turning the table. The hostess led it silently. At a certain agreed moment, usually after the releve, she would turn her own head from her right-hand neighbour to her left-hand neighbour, and the entire table would follow, as though a breeze had moved through a cornfield. You did not crosstalk across the table. You did not hold more than one conversation at a time. You did not raise your voice. You did not gesture with your fork. You kept your elbows close to your ribs. You did not drink your wine before the host had raised his glass. And you did not, for the sake of all that was decent, mention the legs of the turkey, or the breast of the pheasant, or the thighs of the chicken. Such words were not suitable. The polite phrases were drumstick and wing and white meat and dark meat, and the entire table used them with the patience of a committee discussing a tender. At the end of dinner, the hostess rose, caught the eyes of the other ladies one by one, and led them back to the drawing room, leaving the men alone with the port, the walnuts and the cigars. This was the famous withdrawing of the ladies, and it could last anywhere from 15 minutes to a full hour. Sometimes, if the port was unusually good, the ladies upstairs would begin to wonder whether the gentlemen had remembered them at all. The curious shyness around legs and thighs at the dinner table was not just a joke about poultry. It was the surface expression of a much deeper Victorian unease about the human body itself. If you sat in a drawing room in 1875 and spoke of a child as being under the weather, or a cow as having a hurt limb, or a pianist as practicing rapid passages with his lower extremities, you were doing the work of a whole age. To the Victorians, the body was a slightly embarrassing fact, like a relative who had made his money in trade. You acknowledged it, but you did not dwell on it. You did not name its parts, and you absolutely did not let the word leg roam free in polite conversation, at least not in the presence of an unmarried woman or a visiting clergyman. Pregnancy, for instance, was a condition that one did not name. A woman expecting a child was said to be in an interesting condition, in a delicate state, enceinte, if you wanted to slide gently into French, or simply expecting. Actual discussion of what was happening inside her body was restricted to her husband, her mother, her sister if she had one, and her doctor, who might, in some households, examine her through a linen sheet stretched across the bed, so he could not see her directly. This was not as universal as the myth suggests, but it was certainly practiced in some upper-middle-class households, particularly those with the grandest doctors. Historians still argue whether the sheet examination was truly common, or whether it is one of those practices that survives in the historical record because a few prudish households wrote about it in shocked letters, which then became the picture that later generations took for the whole truth. But even the fact that it existed at all tells you something. Childbirth itself was, by long tradition, an event conducted entirely by women, with the doctor summoned only if complications arose. In rural villages it was still the midwife. The local handywoman who came to deliver, by the 1860s and 1870s, Middle-class childbirth was gradually shifting into the hands of male doctors, and chloroform, first used in obstetrics by the Edinburgh doctor James Young Simpson, in 1847, was becoming an acceptable relief from pain, especially after Queen Victoria herself accepted chloroform for the birth of Prince Leopold. In 1853, the Queen's endorsement did a great deal to silence the very loud voices of clergymen who had insisted that the pain of childbirth was biblical and therefore holy. If the Queen could take chloroform, so could the draper's wife in Coventry. Bathing was another surprisingly restrained matter. The Victorian bathroom as a distinct, plumbed private room inside the house was a novelty of the last third of the century. Before that, a hip bath was brought into the bedroom, filled by servants carrying jugs of hot water from the kitchen range, and you bathed in front of the bedroom fire, screened by a folding cloth screen. Gentlemen might bathe daily. Ladies in many middle-class houses bathed twice a week at most, for both practical reasons and a lingering belief that too much immersion was either weakening to the constitution or, in older books, positively dangerous. Faces, hands, necks and armpits were washed daily at a small washstand with a urine basin. Baths with soap, hair washing, and full immersion were, in some households, special events reserved for Saturday evening, ready for Sunday church. There was also a deep Victorian anxiety about what we now call personal privacy. A respectable household made great efforts to separate the functions of the body from the life of the household. Water closets, the forerunners of our modern flushing toilets, were tucked away under staircases or in small rooms off the landing. They were sometimes lined with panelled mahogany to make them look like miniature libraries. In very grand houses, the water closet had its own little anteroom so that it could be approached, used and departed from without the user crossing paths with anyone else. Chamber pots remained common into the 1890s, kept in elegant little cabinets in bedrooms for night use, and emptied in the morning by a servant who was expected, as a matter of delicate tact, to not exist. Servants who emptied chamber pots wore aprons. They came upstairs at prearranged hours. They were, by family convention, invisible. The invisibility of servants was itself one of the strangest rules of Victorian life, and it deserves its own full attention shortly. For now, simply notice that bodily functions were concealed, named in euphemisms and treated as a kind of inconvenient secret that the whole family agreed never to mention. Sweat, for example, was not a word polite people used. A gentleman, if he noticed his brow was damp, might mention that he had become overheated, and a lady, if she was noticing the same, spoke of being in a dew, which is, I have to admit, a rather lovely expression and one I would like to reintroduce into modern English. Even medical consultations reflected this shyness. A gentleman attending to a female patient was expected to avoid direct examination of anything considered intimate, which included most of the body below the collarbone. He might press on a gentleman doctor stethoscope through the fabric of a chemise. He might ask the patient to describe a symptom in writing. Some physicians carried mannequins, little ivory dolls on which a lady might point to the area of her pain without naming it aloud. A number of these dolls survive in museums of medical history. They are tiny, jointed, and quite beautiful. They stand as small, pale witnesses to a generation that preferred to communicate pain through a model rather than to speak the words. If you imagine a quiet consulting room in a Harley Street house in 1879, a fire burning low, a female patient with a gloved finger touching the belly of a 6-inch ivory woman while the doctor watches respectfully, you are seeing something that feels like theatre and like tenderness both at once. Drift now from the consulting room down a narrow flight of back stairs, past the green baize door, and into the servants' world, because the Victorian middle-class home had two entirely separate ecosystems running on top of one another, and the invisibility of the lower ecosystem was itself one of the most carefully policed rules of the age. You have stepped into the servants' corridor. The gas is kept low here. The walls are whitewashed rather than papered. The floor is scrubbed flagstone rather than carpeted. The air smells of boiling linen, soap, coal smoke, and roast mutton. Somewhere above your head, the family is pretending, with admirable dedication, that none of this exists. A large Victorian townhouse might employ, in addition to the family, a butler, a housekeeper, cook, a lady's maid, a valet for the master, 2 or 3 housemaids, parlour maid, a kitchen maid, a scullery maid, a nursery nurse, a governess, a boot boy, a footman or 2, and a coachman with his stable boys and grooms living over the mews. That is perhaps 18 or 20 people who worked in the house, above and below for the comfort of a family of 6. Even a modest middle-class home, a doctor's or a solicitor's, would run to a cook, a housemaid, and a nursemaid for the children. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in full in 1861, is essentially a handbook for how to run such a house, and it sold more than 60,000 copies in its first year, which tells you how hungry the middle classes were for instruction on the art of being waited on. Isabella Beeton herself was 25 when the book came out, which still surprises people. She was a clever, sharp young woman who died of puerperal fever at 28. After the birth of her fourth child, in 1865, her posthumous fame would have astonished her. Her book instructs the housekeeper on hiring staff, describes wages down to the shilling, lists menus for every season, explains the care of silver, recommends how often to clean a chandelier, and even tells you what to do if a servant steals a pocket handkerchief. She was not always right, and modern cooks shudder at some of her recipes, but she captured a moment. For Victorian middle-class women reading her in their parlours, she was reassurance. There is a method. There is a right way. You can run a respectable household if only you learn the rules. The rules for servants were built around one silent, overarching principle. The family should never have to see the work. Servants cleaned fires before the family rose, so that when the master came down to breakfast, the grate was already burning brightly and the hearthstone was already swept. Maids emptied the chamber pots between 7 and 8 in the morning. While the family was still dressing, they dusted the drawing room before luncheon. They laid the table, lit the gas, opened and closed curtains, all from a back staircase that allowed them to appear and disappear like shy ghosts. They did not speak unless spoken to. They did not make eye contact in the corridor. They stepped aside, pressed to the wall when a family member passed. They knew the names of every member of the household, but were not entitled to use them. A housemaid referred to the sons of the house as Master Edward, or Master George, even when the boys were grown men. The eldest daughter was Miss Ellis. The others were Miss Mary, Miss Louisa, and so on, by given name. The mistress was Madam, the master was Sir. There was a great deal of standing in the hallway, waiting to vanish upon command. Wages were small, conditions long. A house parlour maid in 1880 might earn between £16 and £20 a year, plus her uniform, her room, and her food. Out of that she needed to buy her boots, her stockings, her cap and apron, and pay for anything she broke. A single dropped teacup might cost her a whole month's wages. She rose at 5:30, often earlier in winter when fires had to be built before the family was cold. She worked until 10 at night. She was allowed one afternoon and one evening off per week, and a Sunday afternoon for church or for a visit to her own mother if her mother lived nearby. She slept in an attic, sometimes shared on a narrow iron bed, with the house's unpapered roof above her. In summer it was airless. In winter it was glassy with cold. Her window was tiny. Her candle was thin. She kept a Bible, a letter from home, perhaps a picture of her sweetheart if she had one, in a small wooden box by the bed. She was expected to leave service the moment she married, because married women servants were a scandal the Victorians could not quite imagine. Servants in fiction are sometimes cheerful, sometimes sulky, sometimes sinister. In real diaries they are mostly tired. Hannah Culwick, for instance, was a London maid who kept a diary from the 1850s onward, and her pages are full of the sheer physical grind of her days. Blacking the grates, whitening the hearthstone with a donkey stone, scouring the pots, carrying coal buckets up flights of stairs, polishing the brass. She wrote that her hands, by the age of 30, were so rough they scratched the fine linen she ironed. Hannah also kept up, secretly, a long and strange romance with a middle-class journalist named Arthur Munby, who was fascinated by working women and eventually, in private, married her. Historians still argue whether their relationship was tender, exploitative, or both at once, but the diaries remain. They are one of the clearest windows into the life of a Victorian servant, and they show us a woman who was funny, religious, tough, sentimental, and deeply aware that the society she served required her to be invisible. The rules of invisibility extended to the children of the house too, though for different reasons. Victorian upper-middle-class children were not meant to be seen at most of the day, and when they were allowed into the drawing room, usually just before dinner, they were expected to arrive cleaned, quiet, and dressed in clothes they would not have chosen. The phrase, "children should be seen and not heard," which sounds to modern ears like a harsh old proverb, was at the Victorian height closer to a household motto. Children lived upstairs in the nursery with a nurse or a nanny. They took meals there until they were old enough to be promoted, around the age of 7 for boys and sometimes a little later for girls, to the family dining room, and even then only for breakfast, or sometimes for the family luncheon on Sundays. A Victorian child might see his own mother for about 20 minutes a day, between 5 and 5:30, when he was scrubbed, brushed, and sent down to the drawing room to kiss her on the cheek, speak politely, and listen to whatever she wished to say. before being removed upstairs again for supper and bed. This sounds, told that way, rather cold, and in some households it was, but in many houses, the nursery was where childhood actually lived, warmly and messily, and the mother's 20 minutes was a small ritual that meant as much to her as to the child. There are countless letters from Victorian mothers describing the sharp joy of hearing their children's voices on the nursery stairs, the smell of clean hair, the small damp face at bedtime. Motherhood was idealised almost to the point of worship. Every Victorian magazine printed sentimental poems about mothers. Every parlour had an engraving of a mother and child on the wall. Yet the actual day-to-day care of children was largely delegated to nursery staff. A wealthy woman was expected to oversee the household and guide the moral development of her children, but not to change nappies, not to spoon food, and not, heaven forbid, to do any of the physical work of parenting. A nanny did that. A good Victorian nanny, the nurse of the nursery wing, was a formidable figure. She could remain in a family for decades. She often outlived the parents. She was addressed by the children as nurse or nan or nanny, and she ruled her floor of the house with unquestioned authority. She decided what the children ate, when they played outside, when they did their reading, when they went to bed, and how they were punished. She bathed them, sometimes in a hip bath set up in the nursery, sometimes in a large tin tub lined with flannel. She told them stories. She knew their nightmares. She was, practically speaking, the most important adult in their early lives, and many Victorians in their memoirs write more warmly of nurse than of their own mother, which was, when you think about it, both a tribute and a tragedy. Children's clothes were their own strange world. Boys and girls up to around the age of 4 wore identical long gowns, which was a practical convention because nappies could be changed easily under a skirt, and it made no sense to tailor trousers for a body that was changing shape every 3 months. This is why Victorian photographs often show a family of daughters, one of whom turns out, on inspection of the caption, to have been a boy. Around the age of 4, a little boy was breeched, which is to say promoted into short trousers, a little jacket and sometimes a sailor suit, which was a deeply Victorian fashion born of Queen Victoria's own decision to dress Prince Albert Edward in a miniature Royal Navy uniform in 1846. The sailor suit became a craze that lasted, in slightly varying forms, until the First World War. Little girls, meanwhile, stayed in dresses which lengthened gradually as they grew. An adolescent girl's first long-hemmed dress, reaching to the floor, was a significant rite of passage, often coinciding with the first putting up of her hair into an adult. Style. Usually at around 15 or 16, discipline in Victorian childhood was stricter than our sensibilities would approve today, but it varied enormously. In some households, corporal punishment was routine, including canings for boys and slapping of little girls by governesses. In other households, particularly those influenced by early educators like Friedrich Froebel, the inventor of the kindergarten, children were allowed to play, to invent, to make mess, and to learn through exploration. Froebel's ideas reached England in the 1850s and spread quickly among middle-class reformers. By the 1880s, kindergarten was a respectable word, and English mothers were giving their children small wooden gifts, the Froebel blocks, that encouraged free assembly and imagination. Historians still argue whether the 19th century was mostly cruel or mostly kind to its children, and the truthful answer is that it was both, depending on the family, the class, the city, and the particular child. Boys were educated, usually, at boarding schools from the age of 8 or 9. Rugby, Eton, Winchester, Harrow, and dozens of smaller institutions churned out generations of young men with Latin, some Greek cold baths, and a profound conviction that the British Empire depended on their ability to take a beating with dignity. Girls were educated at home by a governess, or increasingly after the 1860s, at small girls' schools and eventually at pioneering institutions like Cheltenham Ladies' College, founded in 1853, and Girton College at Cambridge, founded in 1869. Victorian girls' education was regularly mocked in novels as frivolous, full of music and deportment and French, but by the 1890s, thousands of women were studying mathematics, science and classics seriously, and the whole landscape was quietly rewriting itself. It was a revolution that was largely invisible to the society that held it, rather like a servant sliding past a family member in the corridor. Out on the street, Victorian rules continued, though perhaps more subtly. Step with me then, out of the nursery, out of the house, and into the foggy afternoon of a London high street in 1884. The street lamps have not yet been lit, but the fog is thickening quickly, and there is that particular soft yellow-green tinge to the air that Londoners called a pea souper, because it looked like a bowl of overcooked pea soup. You're walking east along Oxford Street. A gentleman in a top hat passes you. You do not bow to him. You do not smile. You do not catch his eye. You do not, heaven forbid, speak. Unless he has been introduced to you by a mutual acquaintance at a drawing room earlier in the year, you do not know him, and you cannot even a little acknowledge him. If he is a gentleman, he will not take any notice of you. Either you are two polite planets in separate orbits. This was the Victorian rule of the cut. Cut direct was the deliberate withholding of acknowledgement when meeting someone in public, and it was exercised on two different categories of person. First, on strangers, because to recognise a stranger is to invite impertinence, and second, on acquaintances who had fallen from grace, because acknowledgement would be an endorsement of their continued respectability. A cut direct was achieved with perfect composure, a calm gaze into the middle distance, and not the smallest twitch of the eyelid as the other person passed by. It was a surprisingly elegant weapon. The cut indirect was gentler. The eye met the other person's and then quietly drifted off, as though you had just remembered a piano lesson. A cut sublime involved raising your eyes to the sky as though suddenly fascinated by a cloud, so that the other person simply was not in your field of view. The cut sublime was considered very ladylike. If, on the other hand, you did know the gentleman approaching, he would raise his hat to you. Not remove it, merely lift it slightly and hold it above his head, for the length of a heartbeat. You inclined your head in return. You did not smile too broadly, because an excessive smile in the street was considered forward. You kept walking. You did not stop unless stopped. If he wished to speak with you, he would fall into step beside you, but only if the pavement was wide enough and only if you seemed willing. A true gentleman never imposed. A gentleman on the pavement always walked on the outside, close to the road, so that if a carriage splashed mud or worse, it would soil his own trousers rather than her skirt. This was a genuine practical courtesy that survived into the 20th century and occasionally still survives today, usually among people who have no idea why they're doing it. In general, Victorian pedestrians moved in a complicated choreography. Men raised their hats to ladies they knew and bowed to clergymen. Ladies curtsied in very slight form. To older ladies they respected, especially to duchesses, dowagers, and clergymen's wives. Men of the lower classes touched their caps to gentlemen. Costermongers, street sweepers, and cabmen all touched forelocks to customers and policemen. The police, whose role on London streets had been greatly expanded after the 1829 founding of the Metropolitan Force by Sir Robert Peel, were known as peelers or bobbies, both names derived from Peel himself, and they operated within their own complicated politeness, tipping their helmets to women, addressing labouring men as sir, and arresting drunks only with as much dignity as they could muster. Street vendors had their own protocol. A lady approaching a flower seller was to catch her eye, not speak too loudly, ask politely for a bunch of violets or a posy for the buttonhole, pay the stated price with a small extra coin for kindness, and move on. To haggle was the work of the lower classes at the Great Open, markets, and a lady did not haggle. A lady said thank you. Costermongers, on the other hand, could and did shout their wares with tremendous creativity. There are recordings from the very end of the Victorian period, made by early phonograph pioneers, of London street cries, cherries ripe, 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 strawberries all the way from Hampton, hot eels and pies, that give you some faint feel for the noise and colour that mingled with the fog on those pavements. It was a street musical, running from dawn until late at night, pitched perfectly to the passing trade. Now consider the crossing of a street. London had no traffic lights. Horses, carts, omnibuses, hansom cabs, growlers, and later, from 1897, the first early motor vehicles all clogged the roads. Crossing a major thoroughfare was dangerous, and there were specialist workers, the crossing sweepers, who stationed themselves at key junctions and, for a tip, cleared a path through the horse dung, the straw, the slurry of mud, and the fresh accidental contributions of whatever creature had just passed. Some crossing sweepers were boys as young as 7, scraping a meagre living from the generosity of the well-off. Others were old men. One particularly famous crossing sweeper, Charles McGee, stood at the junction of Fleet Street and Ludgate Hill in the 1840s and 1850s, was known to every lawyer, judge and journalist in London, and appeared in so many sketches that a curious reader today can look him up and find caricatures of his bearded, weather-beaten face on numerous Victorian illustrations. He left a small fortune, by some accounts to the child of a friend, having lived simply on small coins dropped into his hat by gentlemen in a hurry. Historians still argue whether the fortune was real or merely a newspaper exaggeration, but the portrait of a dignified crossing sweeper saving year by year from tiny tips is charming enough to be worth believing anyway. Once back indoors, perhaps at another friendly drawing room, you might find yourself confronted by flowers, and the flowers might, if you knew how to read them, be talking. Victorian floriography, the language of flowers, was one of the most charming and slightly absurd codes of the age. It began in its modern form with a little book called Le Langage des Fleurs, published in France in 1819 by a writer using the name Charlotte de Latour, which was a pseudonym. The English and American versions multiplied. By the 1850s, a middle-class drawing room might contain a shelf of small, illustrated dictionaries of flowers, each one slightly different from the others, with hand-coloured plates and tiny captions. A red rose meant love. A yellow rose, depending on the dictionary, meant either jealousy, friendship, or the withdrawal of love. A white rose meant innocence. A forget-me-not meant rather literally remembrance. A tuberose meant dangerous pleasures. A lily of the valley meant the return of happiness. A marigold meant pain and grief. A dahlia meant dignity. A sweet pea meant delicate pleasures, or sometimes farewell. An ivy leaf meant fidelity. An oleander meant beware. The difficulty was that the dictionaries did not agree. A gentleman posting a bunch of yellow tulips to a young lady might believe he was expressing hopeless love because that is what his dictionary said, while the young lady, consulting her own dictionary, might read the gift as declaration of sunny friendship. The consequences of these small disagreements could be severe. Historians still argue whether entire Victorian engagements fell apart because of competing floriography. Manuals? And while we have no clean case studies, there are fragments of letters in which ladies complain to their sisters about gifts they do not know how to interpret. He has sent me a bunch of yellow tulips, one letter of 1867, laments, and I cannot tell if he loves me or pities me. Young men sent bouquets in small bunches called tussie-mussies, held together with a silver filigree holder, and these were often intended for young women to wear on their dresses, or carry during an evening's entertainment. The girl, in return, could wear the flowers over her heart to suggest acceptance, over her ear to suggest she was thinking, or in her hair to suggest pride. Some manuals even instructed men how to read how a lady had positioned her gift. If she wore the posy low at her breast, yes. At her waist, perhaps. In her hair, no. If she pressed it into her reticule as she left, she had chosen not to answer you at all and had taken your question home with her to consider. Beyond florography, the language of fans was another sweetly silly Victorian code. This one was advertised mostly by fan manufacturers, particularly the French firm of Duvelleroy, which published a pamphlet in 1827 explaining the secret language. In drawing rooms, in the 1880s, a young lady could, the manual claimed, communicate entire sentences by the way she held her fan. Moving the fan across the left cheek meant, I do not love you. Moving it across the right cheek meant, I love you, drawing it across. The eyes meant, I am sorry. Twirling it in the left hand meant, we are watched. Resting the closed fan against the right ear meant, you have changed. Presenting the fan shut meant, do you love me? Presenting it half open meant, you are a flirt. There were at least 50 separate signals, according to the more elaborate lists, and no woman on earth could possibly have memorized them all, nor, more importantly, trusted her hopeful suitor to have done so. The language of fans was most likely a charming marketing fiction, more useful as a flirting concept than as an actual system. Young people probably flirted as they always have done, with direct glances, with light touches, with the accidental brush of a sleeve against a sleeve, and then blamed any clear message on the fan, which is a very Victorian solution. Still, the idea that objects could speak where words could not was genuinely part of the Victorian imagination. You sent a Valentine card, not in the whimsical chocolate box style we associate with later centuries, but as an elaborate pierced paper creation with tiny poems, sometimes cruelly cruel if the card was a vinegar valentine, a 19th century novelty, of caustic insult cards sent anonymously to annoying neighbours, overbearing landladies or hopeless suitors. Valentines could be love letters or they could be little bombs. The Royal Mail, by the 1820s, was handling more than 1 million valentines each February, and the post office had to hire extra staff for the second week of the month just to cope. Courtship in general depended on indirectness. A direct declaration of love was shocking. A man did not say to a woman, I love you, early in the relationship. He spoke to her father first. He asked permission. He looked at his boots. He noted his prospects, his income, the state of his business, or his stipend, the fact that he had a small property in Shropshire. The father gave, or withheld, permission to propose. Permission was given. The young man was then allowed to speak to the young woman, sometimes in the garden, often under the chaperonage of a mother or an aunt who sat at a polite distance pretending to read a book. The words themselves were usually a formal question, offered nervously. Then the girl, who had been in love with him for months, gave the formal answer she had rehearsed in her head 100 times. The whole thing was performance. Yes, but the feelings inside the performance were ordinary feelings of real human longing, and the rules were not there to imprison affection, but to make sure. Affection led somewhere, in that age, where a woman's economic future was almost entirely bound to her marriage. Let us step now into the courting garden, because chaperonage is a rule worth sitting inside for a while. You are, imagine, 17 years old, in a village in Kent, in the summer of 1878. You are the daughter of a vicar. You're sitting on a wrought iron bench under the shade of a lime tree. Your mother, who is 52 and widowed, sits about 15 feet away on a similar bench, reading a volume of the essays of Thomas Carlyle, which she is not actually reading but is using as a shield. A young man who, until 3 weeks ago, you had never spoken to, sits beside you. His name is Mr. Edwin Carruthers. He is 23. He is a junior clerk at a solicitor's office in Canterbury. He has come to call on your mother 3 times already. He has brought a small bouquet of pinks from his own mother's garden. His collar is too tight. His shoes are polished. He is trying, very hard, to speak at the ordinary, gentle tempo that middle-class Englishmen are trained to use, but his voice keeps catching. You sit, you will remember later, with your gloved hands folded in your lap, the bright afternoon sun patterning the gravel path through the leaves of the lime. You cannot touch his hand. You cannot very strictly meet his eyes for longer than a second. You cannot invite him indoors without your mother's approval. He cannot propose to you today, because he has not yet been invited to speak to your mother's brother. Your uncle, who is acting in a sort of fatherly capacity in the absence of your dead father, but you are allowed, under your mother's slow, careful gaze, to talk about the weather, the prospects of the harvest, a recent concert at the parish hall at which the choir sang rather, well, except for the sopranos, and the quality of a recent novel by Mr. Thomas Hardy that everyone is reading but nobody's quite certain they should admit to liking. This is chaperonage, and chaperonage, for a girl of your class in 1878, was a rule so deep it was the air you breathed. An unmarried, respectable young woman was, by the standards of the upper middle class, never to be alone in a room with a young man who was not her father or brother. She did not walk with a young man without a mother, an aunt, a married sister, or, in a pinch, an unmarried older female friend. She did not ride in a carriage with him, not even for a short journey, without another person present. She did not correspond with him without her mother's approval. Though once an engagement was formal, daily letters of enormous length became normal and indeed were expected. She did not dance more than twice with the same partner at a ball, because 3 dances was tantamount to a declaration, and 4 was understood as engagement. Historians still argue whether the 2-dance rule was universal or just a London invention, but etiquette manuals consistently drew the line at 2. A gentleman asking a young lady for a third was either serious or impertinent, and she had about 15 seconds to decide which. Balls themselves were the great public marriage market of Victorian Britain. Society debutantes had their coming out round the age of 17 or 18 at their first large ball, traditionally presented at court in the case of the aristocracy, or at a private family ball in the case of the gentry and upper middle class. The season ran from April to August in London, with a mad concentration of events between mid-May and mid-June. A mother with a daughter to marry off hired a small house in Mayfair or Belgravia, launched the girl at a long and exhausting schedule of dinners, teas, private concerts, public parks, operas and evening parties, and hoped, by the end of August, to have an engagement. If no engagement resulted, the girl went home to the country for the autumn and was brought out again the following year. After 3 seasons without an engagement, whispers began. After 5, she was considered unlikely to marry at all and was gently redirected by relatives into other useful social roles, helping with the parish, being a companion to an elderly relative, or perhaps a governess if the family finances required it. Fortunes, as you can imagine, helped. So did beauty, wit, connection and luck. So did perfect floor manners. A girl who danced well, smiled warmly without appearing flirtatious, spoke to everyone without monopolizing anyone, and left a ballroom without being the last to leave, was considered accomplished. A girl who laughed too loud, drank more than half a glass of champagne, or sat out with a single gentleman in the conservatory for longer than 5 minutes, could be quietly destroyed by the morning's gossip. The morning papers carried the names of prominent hostesses and the fact of their parties. The afternoon calls carried everything else. A misstep at 11 at night was common knowledge by the 3 to 5 o'clock visiting hour the next day. There is a memoir by the writer Lady Dorothy Neville, published near the end of her life in 1906, in which she describes the terror of making one's debut as standing on a narrow ledge above an abyss of gossip. That is a very exact phrase, and it is why chaperonage existed. The chaperone was, in the best cases, a protector, not a jailer, standing between the young woman and the whole machinery of judgment, ready to intervene before a misstep could become a ruin. When a marriage was finally settled, the chaperonage eased a little. Engaged couples were permitted to walk together without an older woman hovering. They were permitted to hold hands, discreetly under a lap rug in a carriage. They were permitted to kiss, once at the close of the formal engagement, and that was considered a major event in the lives of many Victorian couples, who often remembered the exact time of day and the quality of the light. After the proposal came the engagement, and Victorian engagements were a negotiated season of their own. You are now engaged to Mr. Carruthers. The news has been announced in the drawing room, first to your mother, then to your uncle, then in a letter to your only brother, who is away with his regiment in India and will not reply for 7 weeks. The next step is the announcement in the local newspaper and, if the family has any standing at all, in the Times. The Times engagements column, famously, could be read on its own as a sociological map of Britain. You read it through the 1870s and 1880s, and you watch the slow intermarriage of the gentry with the successful industrial families, the careful absorption of American heiresses, the movement of money into titles and of titles into respectability. Engagements lasted, traditionally, between 6 months and 2 years. Shorter was considered hurried and suspicious. Longer was considered a sign that someone was waiting to inherit or to save. During the engagement, the young couple exchanged daily letters when they were apart, and carefully chaperoned walks when they were together. The young woman began, with the help of her mother, to assemble her trousseau, which was the wardrobe and household linen she would bring into her new married life. A standard middle-class trousseau of 1880 might include a dozen linen bedsheets, a dozen pillowcases, 2 dozen linen table napkins, 6 embroidered tablecloths, 6 plain tablecloths, a dozen silk stockings, a dozen cotton stockings, a dozen chemises, a dozen pairs of drawers, a dozen nightgowns, 6 combing jackets, 6 petticoats, a walking dress, a carriage dress, a dinner dress, a wedding dress, and a going-away costume for the journey to the honeymoon. Every piece was embroidered or monogrammed with the woman's new initials. An entire trousseau was often 3 months' work for a team of seamstresses. Some of it was new. Some of it was inherited from a grandmother, recut, retrimmed, and remonogrammed. The wedding itself, in the middle of the century, was a surprisingly modest affair by our current standards. Victoria and Albert had married in 1840, and Victoria set a number of important fashions that we still use today. She chose to wear white, which, contrary to common belief, was not the unbroken wedding tradition of the preceding centuries. Brides had married in coloured silks, in pale blues, in deep crimsons, in any dress they liked. Victoria wore white because she wanted to show off the lace of her veil, which had been made by a small, nearly bankrupt lace-making community in Honiton, Devon, and her decision saved the entire industry. After 1840, white became the colour of respectable brides, and it has remained the default ever since. Victoria's orange blossom wreath, too, set a fashion that lasted into the 20th century. Upper-middle-class Victorian weddings took place before luncheon. Church ceremonies were short. The wedding breakfast, which confusingly was a full midday meal served around noon, was a family affair at the bride's home. There might be a cold collation, a champagne toast, a rich fruit cake covered in marzipan and hard white icing, and a tearful speech from a bride's uncle or brother. The cake itself was a tiered affair by mid-century, with the top tier traditionally kept for the christening of the first child, because Victorian fruit cake, soaked as it was in brandy and encased in sugar, could keep for a year or 2 without spoiling if stored carefully in a tin. Families did keep such cakes. There are several museum collections in Britain that hold slices of Victorian wedding cake, still intact after 130 years, though I do not recommend nibbling them. Honeymoons in the modern sense, that is, the couple going away alone together, became normal only in the mid-Victorian period. Earlier, a bridal pair would go away with family, often including a sister or a cousin of the bride. For the bridal tour, a journey of a few weeks to Paris, Switzerland, the Italian lakes, or the Highlands of Scotland, depending on budget and taste. By the 1870s, the couple travelled alone, or with only a maid and a valet, and the trip itself acquired something like the privacy we expect from a honeymoon today. There is a charming diary entry by a young Yorkshire bride of 1881, describing her very first breakfast alone in an hotel dining room in Pontypool, North Wales, as the strangest thing I have ever done, sitting across a little table from my own husband at 9 in the morning, with no mother, no cousin, no chaperone, and nothing to talk about except whether the toast was good, which it was. Married women were expected to make a graceful transition. Almost immediately they took on new responsibilities and lost some of their old freedoms. They began to manage a household. They began to be formally addressed as Mrs., with their husband's first name attached unless his social position required full formality. Mrs. Edwin Carruthers, not Mrs. Edith Carruthers. The married woman essentially vanished into her husband's initials on the page. Legally, too, she largely vanished. Before the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, a woman's property, earnings, and legal identity passed, on marriage, to her husband. He controlled her inheritance. He could legally take her wages. He had, until 1891, the legal right to compel her to live with him. The Victorian marriage bond was, in law, strikingly unequal. Historians still argue whether the reforming acts made as much difference in daily life as campaigners had hoped, but they certainly changed the paper architecture of marriage, and little by little, they changed the expectations of what marriage meant. By the 1890s, a married middle-class woman was often in practice much more of an independent actor than her grandmother had been in the 1840s, though the social rules around her had hardly changed at all. Once married, a woman had a new set of unwritten rules to learn, and one of them involved the ritual of tea. We have reached tea. We could hardly have a Victorian episode without reaching tea. You are, picture it, in a suburban villa in Leamington Spa in the year 1888. The afternoon is damp. Outside, the laurel hedge drips quietly. Inside, in the drawing room, the fire is burning steadily, and on a small lace-covered table beside the fireplace, your hostess is laying out the most carefully calibrated social ritual of the English day: a silver tea tray, a silver teapot, a silver milk jug, a silver sugar basin, a silver slop bowl for discarded tea leaves, which, by the way, is itself a little Victorian marvel of domestic engineering, 2 porcelain cups, 2 saucers, 2 small plates, and, on a 3-tiered cake stand, an assortment of tiny sandwiches, little scones, a plum cake cut in thin slices, and a few sugared biscuits. You arrived at 4:15, exactly as invited. You did not, under any circumstances, arrive early, because early arrival would have caught your hostess in the delicate act of unveiling her own tray. You did not arrive late, because that would have been rude. You arrived in a walking dress, because it is afternoon. You greeted your hostess, kissed her lightly, sat on the indicated chair, and made small, soft remarks about the weather. Now, the tea itself, afternoon tea as a distinct meal, was reportedly invented, or at least popularised, by Anna, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, in the 1840s. She complained, she wrote in a letter, of a sinking feeling at around 4 in the afternoon, because dinner had drifted later and later in upper-class life, into the evening around 8, leaving a long and hungry afternoon gap. She asked for a small meal in her private rooms, just tea and a few things to eat. To bridge the hunger, friends began to call at that hour to share it. The habit spread. By the 1860s, afternoon tea was a social fixture. By the 1880s, it was practically a religion. Historians still argue whether the Duchess really invented it or whether she simply happened to be the fashionable lady credited by later memoirs, because various forms of afternoon refreshment had existed for decades. But her name stuck. The hostess served the tea herself. Not a maid, at least not in the middle-class tea ritual. The act of pouring was part of the intimacy of the occasion. She asked you how you took it. You said milk, no sugar, or a little milk and 1 lump, or perhaps lemon thank you, if the house ran to lemon, which grand houses did and modest ones did not. She poured the hot tea through a small tea strainer, added the milk or lemon, dropped in the sugar with small silver tongs, and handed you the cup on its saucer. You held the saucer in your left hand, low at your chest. You lifted the cup with your right hand, fingers curled neatly around the handle, never through the handle, never with the little finger extended upwards, which was considered a vulgarity invented by people who had learned their manners from penny magazines. You sipped. You did not slurp. You complimented the tea quietly, perhaps mentioned how charming the cake was, and listened to your hostess's news. The sandwiches were tiny, crustless, made of thinly sliced bread, with fillings of cucumber, egg, watercress, and potted salmon. The scones came with clotted cream, or in less western regions, plain butter. The cakes were small. The conversation was gentle. The mantelpiece clock ticked. The fire settled in the grate. Invitations to afternoon tea were, slightly confusingly, different from invitations to high tea. Afternoon tea, despite its name, was a lighter meal. High tea was larger, eaten around 6 in working-class and Midlands households where the breadwinner came home, hungry from the factory or the shop, and tea served as the main meal of the day. High tea might include meat pies, Welsh rarebit, kippers, boiled eggs, buttered bread, jam, and cake, all at one sitting. The difference between afternoon tea and high tea is, even today, often muddled by travel writers, but Victorian ladies understood the distinction immediately. A middle-class family might sometimes have a kind of hybrid called nursery tea, served to children upstairs with bread, butter and jam at 5, before the parents ate dinner at 7 or 8. Tea-taking also had gender implications. A formal afternoon tea was, in many houses, a largely female occasion. Men might drift in, particularly younger cousins on leave from the army or fathers coming home from the office, but the ceremony itself was female. When gentlemen were present, conversation became more general. When they were absent, women spoke very quietly about things they would not always say in mixed company: health, pregnancies, the errors of certain neighbours, the quiet grievances of daily life. It was the only sustained, regular time in the week when married middle-class women could gather at each other's houses, untroubled by husbands or children, and speak. The afternoon call with its card and its 5-minute ritual was social. The afternoon tea with its hour and its cake was friendship. This is the soft, lasting gift of the Victorian domestic schedule. It built, into the clock of every day, a moment in which women could sit with women, pour each other's tea, and say for a little while what they really meant. There is a reason that British afternoon tea has survived as a beloved cultural export, while so many other Victorian rules have slipped gently away. It worked if we remain in the drawing room a little longer, though, and listen for the small sounds rising from deeper in the house. We will hear Sundays announcing themselves, because no day in the Victorian week was more tightly wrapped in rule than Sunday. You are in a respectable household in Leeds, 1873. Outside, the mill chimneys are silent for once. The streets are unusually quiet, because the shops, the pubs, most of the theatres, and all of the music halls are closed. The only smells drifting out of the windows are the same smell drifting out of every window, the slow, patient smell of a roasting Sunday joint of beef. Sunday was the great pause of the English week. The rules were many and deeply felt. Church in the morning, possibly church again in the evening, particularly in the more fervent nonconformist households of the Midlands and the North. Between the services, a cold luncheon, because the cook could not be asked to run a full hot meal. Its service, even though a roast would be waiting for dinner at about 1:30. Newspapers were not read for pleasure on Sundays, although a quick check for family announcements was considered acceptable. Cards were not played. Piano playing was permitted only for hymns or for quiet Sunday music, which generally meant a gentle selection from Handel's oratorios, Mendelssohn's Lieder ohne Worte, or the hymn books of Charles Wesley. Children's toys were put away. Small girls were allowed their Bibles and perhaps a board book with coloured pictures of Old Testament scenes. Boys, if they were lucky, were permitted to build something with wooden bricks, so long as the building was biblical, which became, for generations of English small boys, a very loose description indeed. "It's Noah's Ark, Papa," a small boy in a velvet jacket might say, solemnly, while clearly assembling a steam train. Walking out after luncheon was the one true Sunday entertainment. Victorian families strolled. They strolled in the parks, in the botanical gardens, along the promenades of seaside towns, through the grounds of country estates open to respectable visitors, and up and down the parade of their local town or village. The parade was essentially the high street on a Sunday afternoon, when every respectable family walked slowly in their best clothes, bowed to their neighbours, and looked politely at the young women and men whose parents hoped, sooner or later, to arrange some suitable engagement. It was a weekly promenade of eligibility. In Leeds, the fashionable Sunday walk was around Roundhay Park, laid out in the 1870s with lakes, tree-lined avenues, and a grand terrace with a view over the Yorkshire countryside. In London, the Sunday parade was in Hyde Park, particularly along Rotten Row, where the richest families drove their carriages at a stately walk, greeted their neighbours, and allowed themselves to be seen. Historians still argue whether these Sunday promenades declined because of the coming of the motor car or because of the decline of religious observance. Probably both, arm in arm with the great 20th century spread of the weekend. Sabbatarianism, the strict observance of the Sunday rest, was stronger in some circles than in others. In the great northern manufacturing cities, among Methodist, Baptist, Congregationalist, and Presbyterian families, Sunday rules were firm. In London, particularly among the aristocracy, they were looser. The Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, was famously fond of Sunday dinner parties and small quiet. Cards in the library, which shocked Gladstone, the solemn Prime Minister, and entertained almost everyone else. The Lord's Day Observance Society, founded in 1831, campaigned for the passing of laws to close more public amusements on Sundays. They had some successes and many failures. Sunday trading legislation went back and forth for decades. Even as late as the 1880s, enthusiasts were still trying to close the parks on Sundays to musical bands, and the bands, led by the populariser Sir Michael Coster, went on playing, to the immense relief of families who needed somewhere free to go. Servants worked on Sundays too, but lightly. The cook would produce a roast dinner and a cold supper. The housemaid lit fires, emptied chamber pots, and laid out Sunday clothes. But there was an unwritten rule that Sunday afternoons belonged, as far as possible, to the servants' own time. Maids were allowed to walk out with their sweethearts for a few hours, down to the park, or to church again if they were religious. The butler might sit in his own pantry with the household accounts open, and a glass of beer quietly poured. The cook might nap. The upper-middle-class family, drowsing in their drawing-room, understood in a vague way that a kind of pause had settled on everybody. Sunday gave everyone, from master to scullery maid, the one afternoon of the week when they were not quite who they usually were. There was, however, a complete freezing of children's play in the stricter homes. "Good children," wrote one early Victorian nursery manual, "do not laugh out loud on a Sunday. A quiet smile is becoming, a shout is not." Actual children, of course, were not reliably good, and Victorian memoirs are full of the delicious small rebellions of Sunday afternoons. Smuggled picture books, whispered card games under a bed, a secret slice of cake eaten behind a cupboard door, a solemn promise to the governess that the volume being read was the Pilgrim's Progress, when in fact it was a smuggled penny dreadful about pirates. Penny dreadfuls, those cheap serialized magazines filled with bandits, highwaymen, ghostly murderers, and schoolboy heroes, were the guilty secret of thousands of middle-class children who were meant to be reading hymns ancient and modern. The dreadfuls cost a penny. They came out on Fridays. By Sunday afternoon, in countless respectable houses across England, a small boy was lying behind a sofa devouring the latest instalment of The String of Pearls or The Demon of the Heath, while upstairs his mother tried to interest him, without any success, in the Sunday school magazine. Photography, meanwhile, carried its own rituals, and those rituals are worth sitting with, because Victorian photographs are the way most of us now picture the age, and their conventions quietly shape how we think Victorians looked and behaved. You are, let us say, father of 3 children in Birmingham in 1869, and you've decided that the family ought to sit for a daguerreotype, or, by this date, more probably a collodion process portrait at Mr. Fenton's photographic. Rooms on Corporation Street. You dress carefully. You arrive promptly. You usher your wife, your 2 daughters, and your youngest son into a small studio painted an unflattering grey-green, with a window high in one wall to capture the daylight, curtain in the corner, a piano in the other corner for props, a pedestal, a small rustic balustrade, and a painted backdrop of a vaguely Italian landscape. The photographer, Mr. Fenton, is a stooped man in his late 40s who has been in the trade since the 1850s and who will, by 1889, be operating 3 different studios. He positions you with military efficiency. Your wife seated, the daughters in front of her, the elder behind the younger, the baby, also a boy, seated on your knee, held as still as an infant can be held, which is not very. You yourself stand with one hand resting on a pedestal, one foot slightly forward, eyes fixed at a point about 6 feet to the left of the camera, because looking directly at the lens produces a strangely flat and slightly alarming gaze on the finished print. Mr. Fenton disappears under the black cloth, opens the shutter, closes it after a sigh that feels longer than it is, and emerges. Nobody was allowed to breathe. Victorian portraits look serious to us, and we sometimes joke that everyone in the 19th century seems cross. The truth is that holding a smile for the 2, 3 or 5 seconds required by early exposures was almost impossible without the smile collapsing into a grimace halfway through, calm expression, mouth closed, eyes focused, held for the duration, produced a sharp portrait. The grin turned into a blur. This is why your great-great-grandmother looks severe in the photograph on your mantelpiece. She was not angry. She was holding her face as still as she could, while Mr. Fenton slowly counted to 5. Historians still argue whether the unwritten rule of no smiling was about camera, technology, or about a broader cultural preference for grave dignity in portraiture, and the honest answer is both. Royal portraits had always been solemn. The photograph inherited that solemnity and stuck with it for a generation, long after exposures had become fast enough for a smile. Mourning photographs, as we mentioned, were a genuine and tender part of this world, though often overemphasized by modern writers who find them morbid. In a typical Victorian household, the photograph album on the drawing-room table contained a great many living faces and 1 or 2 mournful ones. Each was kept with care. Albums were frequently made of carved wooden covers, leather-bound, with stiff card pages cut to hold carte de visite. the small 4x2-inch photographs that had become an international craze after their invention. In the late 1850s, by a Parisian photographer called André Disdery, cartes de visite the size of small cards were collected, exchanged and kept. Queen Victoria herself had collection albums of them. Cabinet cards, larger and stiffer, replaced them in the 1870s. You could buy cabinet cards of famous people. The Queen, the Prince of Wales, Prime Minister Gladstone, the music hall singer Marie Lloyd, the actor Henry Irving, even the writer Charles Dickens, photographed by a number of the great portrait studios before his death in 1807. Albums themselves had strict conventions. You placed immediate family at the front, extended family next, friends after that. Famous people last. You labelled them in ink with name, relationship and date. A properly kept Victorian album was a beginner's genealogy in a book, a map of a household, its kin, its visitors, and its aspirations. Children's photographs were placed with particular pride. A child who had died was usually kept in the album not in a special section, but in the ordinary chronological flow, which was a quiet form of respect. The child's place in the family had not been erased, only fixed in time. There were rules, too, about the photographs themselves. Young ladies did not sit alone in a studio without a chaperone. A gentleman did not send his photograph to a lady who was not yet engaged to him, except as a general courtesy after an introduction, and even then he often posted it to her mother rather than to her directly. Photographs of couples standing together before engagement were rare and carefully staged. Photographs of couples seated on a bench, touching, were reserved for after the wedding. Post-engagement photographs in which the young man stood behind his seated fiancée with one hand on the back of her chair were a convention so common that it almost constituted an engagement announcement by itself. Historians still argue whether this hand-on-the-chair pose was a strict rule or simply a photographer's shortcut, but it was widespread, and the small visual detail is still recognisable in family albums today. Photographing the dead, in particular infants, sometimes happened in the home. The small coffin was arranged on a table, the child placed inside it, dressed in white or pale blue, with flowers laid at the hands. In some cases the child was propped gently as if asleep. In others the eyes were opened and painted to appear open. These images are, if you look at them in a museum, quietly heartbreaking. They are not ghoulish. They are love pressed into a flat sheet of paper, because the family knew that the small face would otherwise, quickly, fade from memory, and in a century before casual snapshots, that loss was not a possibility to be risked. Let us move again, this time to the seaside. A Victorian summer holiday had an entire body of rules of its own, and the oddest of them took place, quite literally in the water. You're in Brighton in August 1870. The morning is bright. A fresh breeze blows up from the channel, smelling of salt and sun-warmed timber. You walk in your walking dress, along the promenade, past the West Pier, past the stalls selling whelks and winkles, past the German band playing a slightly ragged polka for pennies, down on the shingle, half in the surf, half on dry land. A row of wooden boxes on wheels stand like small seaside huts, with steps leading up one side and doors looking out to sea on the other. These are bathing machines, and they were, for 40 years, the essential furniture of a respectable Victorian beach. The bathing machine was a small dressing room mounted on cartwheels. Its purpose was to allow a lady or gentleman to walk up the back steps fully dressed on the promenade, undress inside while the whole contraption was dragged by a horse into the surf, and then step down the front steps straight into waist-deep water, without ever being seen in a state of semi-dress on the beach itself. The bathing attendant, often an older woman known as a dipper in female machines, or a muscular man known as a bather in male ones, would assist the customer down the steps into the water, help the timid to actually immerse, and sometimes even hold a weak swimmer while the waves rolled gently in. The whole operation preserved the strict segregation of the sexes. Women's bathing machines were, by local rule, clustered at one end of the beach. Men's were at the other. Mixed bathing was considered indecent and was, in some towns such as Margate and Ramsgate, forbidden until the 1890s. Inside the machine the changing was quick, because the floor was damp, the walls clammy and the air close. The lady undressed down to her chemise, then pulled on her bathing dress, which by the 1870s had become a rather spectacular garment, long-sleeved and knee-length at least over a pair of matching bloomer trousers, often trimmed with contrasting braid, belted at the waist, and made of a heavy black or navy wool serge that, when wet, weighed as much as a full coat and hung with the flexibility of a length of carpet. She tied on a pair of canvas bathing shoes, pinned up her hair, tied a rubber bathing cap or a stout straw bonnet over it, and waited while the machine was pulled out by the horse to the agreed depth. Then she descended the steps, often shrieking with shock, because the English Channel in August is, even in a heat wave, not truly warm. The dipper gripped her arm, counted to 3 and, on 3, pushed her firmly down into a wave. This sudden ducking was considered therapeutic. It was meant to shock the system, quicken the blood and clear the liver. A true sea bath of the period was a matter of 4 or 5, total immersions, no actual swimming, and then the dripping lady climbed back up the steps, into her machine, towelled off, dressed again, and was pulled back to shore. Gentlemen had slightly easier rules. Their bathing machines were pulled to a separate section of the beach, where they often emerged wearing nothing at all, because male nude bathing was a long tradition that persisted on stretches of the English coast well into the late 19th century. The poet Matthew Arnold, quite respectable, bathed naked in the sea at Llandudno in the 1860s and left us a private journal entry about the bracing cold. George Bernard Shaw was a fan. Male nude bathing was gradually replaced by shorts and vests, not because of a sudden collapse of Victorian modesty, but because women on public beaches began to walk nearer, and the two sexes could no longer be reliably kept apart. By the 1890s, men wore belted woolen one-pieces similar in cut to the ones still seen in cartoon books, and a small scandal would accompany any man who refused them. There were other seaside rules that feel strange now. Children were allowed to paddle, but only to the ankle under close supervision. Ladies walked on the promenade with parasols, not because rain threatened, but because a suntan was a mark of a working woman, and a pale complexion remained the sign of a lady. The word tanned, applied to a respectable female face, was a small disaster. By the 1890s, rowing boats were popular, but women could only be rowed by a man who was a brother, husband, fiancé or father, or by a hired oarsman approved by the hotel. Ice cream was sold from carts and, by the 1880s, often scooped into glass penny licks, which were small glass, cups that were licked clean and, somewhat horrifyingly, handed back to the vendor, rinsed and passed to the next customer. Public health inspectors eventually stamped out the penny lick in the early 20th, century after tracing several outbreaks of tuberculosis to them. The replacement, the paper cone, was a small triumph of hygiene dressed up as convenience. Seaside towns themselves followed a careful hierarchy. Brighton was fashionable. Eastbourne was respectable. Scarborough was grand. Blackpool was cheerfully working class. Skegness, by the 1890s, had established itself as the quintessential family resort of the Midlands. Each town's beach, its rules, its entertainments, and even its permitted bathing garments differed subtly. The family's choice of summer resort said as much about them as their church, their calling cards, and their children's schools. You could, by the 1890s, travel to the same beach every August for 20 years, see the same families on the same patch of shingle, and by gentle acknowledgement, by a nod and a small smile, establish a summer community that ran parallel to, and just outside, the ordinary world of chaperonage and drawing rooms. Now pedal with me, slowly and a little wobblingly, on to the next great arena of Victorian social invention, which was the bicycle. The bicycle, in its modern form, arrived in the middle decades of the century and came of age in the 1880s and 1890s, and it changed the rules of everything, particularly for women. You are, let us say, the 28-year-old daughter of a Derbyshire doctor in 1895. You have recently acquired a safety bicycle, so called because unlike the enormous penny farthing of the 1870s, which pitched you forwards onto your head with terrifying regularity, the safety bicycle had 2 wheels of equal size, chain drive and a reasonable chance of not killing you. You have paid £9 for it. Your father has muttered, your mother has sighed. Your vicar, visiting yesterday for tea, has made a small joke that was not actually a joke about the athletic sex and unbecoming exercise. You have smiled politely, offered him another slice of cake, and gone on with your plans. You're also wearing, today, a modified costume that would have horrified your grandmother. A divided skirt, known in some circles as a rational dress and in others, with suspicion, as bloomers, after the American reformer Amelia Bloomer, who had publicised the garment as early as the 1850s. Bloomer's own version, a pair of baggy Turkish trousers under a shortened skirt, had failed as everyday wear in the 1850s because society simply refused to accept it. 40 years later, the bicycle forced the issue. A lady could not ride a safety bicycle in a full-length skirt without risking the skirt catching in the chain and pulling her off the machine. Something had to give. By 1895, a whole industry of cycling dress existed. Divided skirts, knickerbockers worn under a short skirt, loose trousers gathered at the knee, serge jackets cut short at the hip. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881 by Lady Harberton and others, had been campaigning for more practical women's clothing for over a decade. and the bicycle was the gust of wind that finally set their sails. The social uproar was enormous. Newspapers ran furious letters about unwomanly garments. Cartoonists drew exaggerated pictures of ladies in baggy trousers smoking cigarettes and looking mannish. Some innkeepers refused to serve ladies in rational dress. In one famous 1898 case, Lady Harberton herself was refused service at the Houtboy Hotel in Ockham, Surrey, because she had arrived in divided skirts. She sued for breach of the 1872 Innkeepers Act, which required inns to serve bona fide travellers, and the jury, to the delight of cycling enthusiasts, ruled that she had been offered alternative accommodation in the bar and was therefore not actually refused service. She lost the case, but the publicity won the war. Within 5 years, divided skirts were tolerated everywhere. Within 10, they were unremarkable. The bicycle had done what decades of rational dress campaigning had not managed. It had made a trouser-like garment seem useful rather than scandalous. The social freedoms that came with the bicycle were astonishing. A middle-class woman could now cycle alone, or with a female friend, to neighbouring villages. She could cycle to a picnic in the countryside. She could go out for the afternoon without her parents arranging a chaperone, because the chaperone principle depended on the chaperone being able to keep up, and no reasonable aunt was going to attempt 10 miles of bicycling in corset. The bicycle was, in practical terms, the first affordable private transport available to a respectable young woman without male assistance. It dissolved very gently some of the iron rules of chaperonage that had structured the courtship world for decades. Susan B. Anthony, the American suffragist, said in 1896 that the bicycle had done more to emancipate women than anything else. And whatever allowances we make for rhetorical enthusiasm, she was not far wrong. Cycling clubs blossomed. The Cyclists Touring Club, founded in 1878 and originally male only, admitted women in 80, which was quite radical for its day. By the 1890s, thousands of respectable young women were members, and the club produced a handbook listing inns, repair shops, and recommended tours. Magazines sprang up. The Lady Cyclist, first published in 1895, reviewed machines, advised on stockings, warned against cycling in certain weathers, and featured letters from riders describing their own adventures. One reader wrote in about a 20-mile tour from Tunbridge Wells to Hastings, in a single afternoon, arriving at the pier in time for tea, which she said had made her feel as strong and as cheerful as any boy. Older generations disapproved. The medical profession split. Some doctors wrote articles warning that cycling would cause a condition they called bicycle face, a sort of permanent grimace from the strain of steering, which vanished as mysteriously from medical literature as it had appeared. Other doctors, more sensibly, argued that moderate cycling strengthened women's backs, lungs and nerves, and improved appetite, sleep, and general cheerfulness. By 1900, the argument was over. Medical opinion held that a woman could cycle as much and as far as she reasonably liked. The bicycle had quietly redrawn the map of female independence. Every chaperone on a park bench, patiently reading Carlyle while her charge sat beside a young clerk under a lime tree, was, although none of them knew it, watching the final chapter of a very particular Victorian rule. The next generation would cycle past without stopping. Historians still argue whether the bicycle truly emancipated women or whether it just modernized them, but the difference is not obvious, and perhaps not important. What is clear is that by the end of Queen Victoria's reign, a respectable young Englishwoman could, with her own money, ride her own machine, wear her own trousers, and visit her own friends, without needing either her mother's permission or the Pope's blessing. Let us move now to the smoking room, which is where many of the men of the Victorian house would spend a small but important portion of their evening, because smoking itself had become, over the course of the century, a ritual with its own extraordinary list of rules. You are in the London home of a successful wool merchant in 1888. Dinner's over, the ladies have withdrawn. The gentlemen, with silent agreement, have risen, pushed their chairs back, and proceeded to a separate room at the back of the house, panelled in dark oak, with leather armchairs, a heavy tobacco-coloured rug, and a fire that is kept small so that the room does not become unbearable. The window is slightly open. There is a small brass bowl on a side table containing the crystalline black residue of previous evening's cigars, carefully kept by the butler for the gardener, who knew the cold ash was useful for repelling slugs. A small silver box holds matches. A cabinet on the wall holds cigars in sealed boxes. The host offers cigars. He does not offer cigarettes, at least not in the grander houses of the 1860s and 1870s, because cigarettes were considered continental, and even slightly bohemian. By the 1880s, cigarettes had gained respectability, partly because of the popularity of the young men returning from service in India, who had acquired the habit during the Crimean War and after. By the 1890s, a gentleman could comfortably offer both cigars and cigarettes, and a gentleman who preferred cigarettes was no longer thought a little artistic. The host lights the cigars with a long spill from the fire. Each guest inclines his head. A cloud of pale blue smoke begins to gather beneath the ceiling. Now the rules. A gentleman did not smoke in a room where ladies were present. He did not smoke in the drawing room, the dining room, the hall, the parlour, the library when ladies were expected, or a bedroom not his own. He smoked in the smoking room. He smoked in his own study with the door shut. He smoked in a gentleman's club. He smoked in a railway carriage clearly marked for smokers. He smoked in a garden, if weather permitted, and even then he stood at a polite distance from the roses, which ladies cared about. He didn't smoke in the street, at least not in the more fashionable streets, although by 1890 the rule was weakening. He did not, above all, smoke in a carriage with a lady, unless she herself, very daringly, had lit a cigarette first, which some very modern ladies did in the 1890s, to the accompaniment of shocked letters to the Times for at least a decade afterwards. He also did not, at dinner, smoke before the toast to the Queen. This was a firm rule. At every formal dinner in England, after the ladies had withdrawn, the host proposed a toast to Her Majesty the Queen. Every gentleman rose, glass in hand, and drank to the monarch. Only after that toast could pipes, cigars, and cigarettes be lit. Historians still argue whether this rule was an invention of the Victorian era, or a survival from the naval tradition of the royal toast. But either way it was universal. In the officers' messes of the army, the toast was drunk seated, privilege granted, reportedly, by William IV to spare his officers from banging their heads on the low beams of a warship, though every regiment had its own version of that particular origin story. A gentleman changed his coat to smoke. The smoking jacket is a wholly Victorian invention, a short, comfortable coat of velvet or silk with quilted lapels and a contrasting collar, put on over one's dinner shirt before entering the smoking room, and taken off before rejoining the ladies. The purpose was simple. It kept tobacco smoke out of the evening dress, which would otherwise go to bed stinking of cigars. A smoking cap, often a round, embroidered cap that looked like something from a stage production of the Sultan's court, was worn over the hair for the same reason. The smoking cap fell out of fashion by the 1890s. The smoking jacket survived, and the smoking jacket itself, in the middle of the 20th century, became an indoor gentleman's dressing garment without retaining any actual connection to tobacco. Outside of the smoking room, the club was the other great temple of Victorian male social life. A gentleman's club of the 1860s, such as White's, Brooks's, Boodle's, the Athenaeum, the Reform, or the Travellers', was a private building in Mayfair or St James's, to which a man was admitted by election after being proposed by existing members and rigorously balloted. A single black ball in the ballot box could exclude him, and clubs regularly rejected wealthy, even titled applicants for obscure reasons known only to the committee. Once admitted, a member could use the club as his daylight to late evening home. He read the newspapers in the morning room. He lunched in the dining room. He wrote letters in the library. He dozed in the leather armchairs of the smoking room. He took a hansom home only when it suited him. He did not, typically, bring his wife, because most clubs, by strict rule, did not admit women, not even as guests. The Athenaeum, which admitted bishops and scientists, still did not admit female spouses into the main rooms until well into the 20th century. Ladies, meanwhile, had their own clubs, though fewer and newer. The Alexandra Club, founded in 1883, was one of the earliest to accept women. The Empress Club, the Ladies' Army and Navy, the Albemarle, each opened in the last 15 years of the century, as a polite but deliberate response to the male monopoly. Every one of them represented a crack in the wall of another Victorian rule. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, a middle-class London woman could belong to her own club, sit in her own smoking room if she wished, and drink the same tea and read the same newspapers as her husband. In his, the smell of the two smoking rooms, however, was still quietly different. Men's rooms smelt of Havana, women's rooms smelt of Turkish cigarettes, jasmine tea, and perhaps a faint trace of revolution. Let us linger a little longer on the theme of the unmarried woman, because one of the most painful and quietly revealing Victorian rules concerned what was to be done with a woman who did not marry. You were in a small parlour in a parsonage in Gloucestershire in 1886. The parsonage belongs to the family of a vicar who has been dead for 8 years. His widow, frail and increasingly deaf, sits by the fire. His 3 unmarried daughters, Miss Mary, Miss Louisa, and Miss Clara, aged 41, 37 and 33 respectively, live with her. There is a brother, a solicitor in Bristol, who has his own family and sends a small allowance each quarter. There is a sister, long married in Yorkshire, who writes once a month and visits twice a year. There are no husbands in this parsonage. There will not now be any husbands. The 3 unmarried daughters are what polite Victorian society called old maids, although in private they called themselves simply the Mrs. Henderson, and they were neither embittered nor pitiable. They were, in fact, mostly competent, cheerful, and very, very tired. The rules for an unmarried middle-class woman in Victorian Britain were strict, but surprisingly well understood. If she did not marry by about the age of 25 or 26, the assumption was that she would probably not marry at all, though there were always exceptions. Her role in the family was then quietly restructured. She might be, as here, the companion and caretaker of an elderly parent. She might, if she had been educated enough, become a governess in another family's household, teaching the children and earning a small salary that did not allow her much dignity but did allow her to keep her own small savings. She might become a lady's companion, paid to accompany a wealthier female relative or family friend to tea, to the theatre and on long European tours. She might, by the 80s, take up nursing, which had been professionalised by Florence Nightingale after her return from the Crimean War in 1856, and which offered salaries low but respectable, and uniforms that, if worn correctly, gave the wearer a kind of secular authority not available to other unmarried women. She might, in a more privileged household, stay at home and become a near-invisible second daughter of the house, permanent decoration of the domestic scene. She would have her own room, often the smallest in the house. She would have her allowance handed out by her brother or her father. She would have her occupations: embroidery, watercolour painting, parish visiting, the reading of novels. She would be expected to accompany younger married sisters to theatres when the sisters' husbands were away. She would be the one who looked after nephews and nieces when mothers were ill. She would be the one who sat with dying relatives. Her life, in the ledger of a Victorian family, was written in the margin. And yet, there is something very important about the Victorian spinster that the conventional sad picture obscures. In large numbers, in diaries and letters, Victorian unmarried women were the quiet engine of middle-class intellectual, charitable and religious life. The parish magazine was often edited by a spinster. The Sunday school was often run by a spinster. The local charity for indigent widows was usually founded by a spinster. A remarkable number of Victorian women writers, publishing under male or neutral pseudonyms, were unmarried. Charlotte Bronte, at least at the time of Jane Eyre, Christina Rossetti, Jean Ingelow, and many others. The great nurse Florence Nightingale never married. The pioneering Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson was the first Englishwoman to qualify as a physician in 1865, and although she eventually married, she began her career as a single woman in defiance of every social rule of her time. Historians still argue whether the Victorian old maid has been unfairly caricatured by later generations, and the answer, on any fair reading of the evidence, is that she has. There was, however, a very real economic precariousness to the life of an unmarried Victorian woman of any class. If her father died without making provision, and her brothers were unwilling or unable to help, she was in trouble. If her savings ran out, she was in serious trouble. If she fell ill and could not work, she was in very serious trouble. The workhouse loomed at the bottom of the ladder, and a number of Victorian memoirs describe, without sentimentality, the fear of the workhouse that lived just behind the respectable clothes of every dependent gentlewoman. Friendly societies, old age pensions not introduced until 1909, and charity trusts gradually created safety nets in the course of the century. But they were patchy, they were inconsistent, and they depended on a woman's respectability, her references, and her ability to keep her troubles quiet. Widows, once past the first shock of grief, found themselves in a slightly different position. If they had been left a settlement, they were often economically independent for the first time in their lives, because a widow controlled her own money in a way that a wife in 1850 did not. Some widows blossomed in this strange half-free state. They travelled, they bought small houses, they campaigned for causes. Queen Victoria, though royal, was in her long widowhood the great patron of this kind of grave, determined independent middle age. Historians still argue whether Victorian widowhood was a trap or a release. The truth depended entirely on money, on health, and on the quality of the dead husband's legal arrangements. A well-provided for widow of 45 in 1880 was often, in practical terms, the most free woman in Britain, which is both wonderful and quietly odd. Unmarried aunts, unmarried sisters, and unmarried governesses were, between them, an enormous proportion of the female population of Victorian Britain. The 1871 census recorded something like 3.4 million unmarried women over 20 in England and Wales, most of them not young girls but grown women who, for whatever reason, had not married and quite possibly never would. Their lives, taken together, ran the charities, the parishes, the schoolrooms, and the hospitals of the country. Society called them surplus women. They called themselves mostly Miss. Let us go back, now to a particular small room in a particular Victorian house, because the Victorian sick room was itself ruled by strict, tender, sometimes exasperating customs, and many of us, if we have spent time with the letters and diaries of the age, feel we know sick rooms as much as we know drawing rooms. You are, imagine, in a bedroom in Clifton again, in 1889. The curtains are half drawn, a small coal fire burns steadily in the grate. The air smells of lavender water, eucalyptus oil, and something harder to place. Perhaps the clean, dry smell of fresh cotton nightclothes changed 3 times a day. In the bed, under a white counterpane, lies a young man of 22. He has had an operation for an appendix that the doctors had only recently learned to remove, and he is recovering slowly. His mother sits by the bed in a low chair. A nurse, dressed in the severe grey and white of the new professional, nursing orders, is preparing a cold compress at the small marble washstand. Sickroom rules were extensive. Visitors came only in daylight hours, in pairs if possible, so that their voices did not tire the patient, and they did not bring pets, hats with decorative feathers that might shed, or anything smelling too strongly. They did not sit on the bed. They sat on a chair placed a respectful distance away. They did not, if the patient was seriously ill, stay longer than 10 minutes. They did not ask direct questions about the condition. They took their information, indirectly from the mother or the nurse afterwards, over tea. They did not attempt to cheer the patient with news of sports or theatre, but talked quietly about the garden, the weather, and the good behaviour of local dogs. The sick room had its own courtesy, a kind of condensed Victorian politeness poured into a smaller glass. Invalidism itself was a recognised social state in the Victorian imagination. A young woman whose nerves were delicate might take to her sofa for months or years. A young man whose lungs had been weakened by a childhood illness might be shipped, at the family's expense, to the south of France, to Madeira or to Switzerland, because sea air, mountain air, or pine-scented air were all believed, with varying degrees of medical justification, to cure conditions that modern medicine would treat otherwise. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the great Victorian poet, lived for years as an invalid in her father's house before her famous elopement with Robert Browning in 1846. Many Victorian writers worked from their beds, propped on pillows, a folding lap desk in their knees, pens in their hands. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote some of Treasure Island in a semi-invalid state in Bournemouth. The bedroom, for many Victorians, was not only a private place for sleep, but a public workplace, sitting room, and even a salon for discreet friends. Medicine itself was changing rapidly. Anesthesia, antisepsis, and the slow rise of what we now recognise as the professional hospital all belonged to the second half of the century. Joseph Lister published his first papers on antiseptic surgery in 1867. Florence Nightingale's notes on nursing came out in 1859. Queen Victoria appointed William McMicking as one of the first physicians in ordinary authorised to use chloroform on the royal family. Cholera, which had devastated British cities in 1832 and 1848, was gradually understood to be waterborne after the painstaking work of John Snow, the Soho doctor who in 1854 famously removed the handle from the broad street pump and stopped an outbreak in its tracks. The 1850s and 1860s saw the creation of the first effective sewage systems in London and other great cities, and the resulting rise in public health was enormous, although the changes were slow and uneven, and even in the 1890s a great deal of drinking water in the poorer districts was still foul. Domestic medicine remained a patchwork. Middle-class households kept family medicine chests, little wooden boxes with labelled compartments containing quinine, ipecac, sal volatile, tincture of opium, tincture of iodine, sticking plaster, rhubarb root, camphor, peppermint oil, and numerous other remedies, some helpful, some harmless, some distinctly not. Laudanum, an alcoholic solution of opium, was given to babies to stop them crying, to women with headaches, to old men with rheumatism, and to almost anybody who seemed to want it. By the 1890s, the dangers were better understood, and many middle-class households had moved to less dangerous over-the-counter remedies, though the damage done by a century of casual opium use was considerable, and had contributed to the deaths of many, including possibly the writer Thomas de Quincey, who lived to 74 but was never really well after his confessions of. An English opium meter was published in 1821. Hygiene rules within the sick room were obsessive in the best houses, and often meaningful. Sheets were changed daily. Handkerchiefs were boiled. Anything the patient touched. If the illness was thought contagious, was either burned or soaked in dilute carbolic acid. Rooms were fumigated, sometimes with sulphur candles that left a yellow stain on the walls for months afterwards. Nurses washed their hands before and after every task, a habit that was becoming standard practice in the 1880s thanks to the campaigns of Nightingale and Lister. These were genuinely life-saving measures, and they contributed to a dramatic decline in puerperal fever deaths and in post-operative infections over the last third of the century. The quiet rules of the Victorian sick room, absurd though some of them now look to us, also included a hardcore of discovery and competence. Historians still argue whether the real medical revolution of the 19th century was driven more by the doctors or by the nurses. The simplest answer is that neither could have done it alone, and that by 1901, the average life expectancy in England had risen above 50 for the first time in recorded history, which is a quiet but towering achievement of the age that got so. Many of its other rules delightfully wrong. Shift with me one last time, back out into the streets, and consider now the pub, the tavern, the gin palace, and the humbler drinking rooms of the Victorian working class, because the rules there were as elaborate as anything in Belgravia, and they deserve acknowledgement in any honest catalogue of Victorian life. You are in Manchester, in a public house called the Hare and Hounds, on a damp Friday evening in 1877. You have just clocked off at the cotton mill. Your hands still smell faintly of oil. You walk in through the main door, and immediately, because you know this pub as you know your own kitchen, you turn left into the public bar. The public bar is the plainest room. Sawdust on the floor, a long wooden counter, a row of beer pumps with brass handles, spittoons on the floor at regular intervals, because a working man of 1877 chewed tobacco and expected somewhere to spit, benches along the walls, the air thick with pipe smoke and the warm smell of beer. Now the rule of the rooms. A large Victorian public house did not have one room. It had at least three. The public bar, where working men drank, the saloon bar, where clerks, shopkeepers and skilled artisans drank, and the private bar or snug, smaller, usually carpeted, partitioned room where respectable women might drink without exposing themselves to the noise of the public bar, and where courting couples, business negotiations and the occasional genteel widow taking a small sherry could all coexist. The glass of beer sold in the public bar was a penny or 3 halfpence. The same glass in the saloon bar was 2pence or 3pence, because the saloon offered cleaner glasses, better tables, and the chance of a seat next to a man in a jacket rather than a man in a fustian waistcoat. The same glass in the snug cost a little more again, because the partition walls were upholstered, the windows were frosted, and a small service hatch allowed a lady to order without having to speak loudly into the main bar. This was a strict, silent social hierarchy. Working men drank in the public bar. They did not, if they respected themselves, move into the saloon bar for their ordinary evening drink. Saloon barmen did not, if they respected themselves, walk into the public bar to order their beer, because the other drinkers would have looked at them with a particular mixture of respect and quiet mockery that discouraged the practice. Landlords enforced the distinctions too. A working man in his shirt sleeves, sweaty from the mill, was gently directed out of the saloon bar. A gentleman in a frock coat, wandering by accident into the public bar, was gently directed into the saloon bar. The rooms were, in effect, social filters. Women's drinking rules were even stricter. A respectable married woman did not drink in the public bar. She might drink, very quietly, in the snug if her husband was with her, or if she was sitting with a female friend and waiting for her husband. An unmarried, respectable woman in most towns did not enter a public house at all, unless accompanied by a father or brother, or unless she was performing one of the small errands that might require it, such as collecting her husband from the bar on a Friday night. Working-class women, especially in the poorest districts of London and the northern cities, had a more complicated relationship with the pub. Many worked in them as barmaids, cleaners and cooks. Many drank in them regularly in the mill towns. Some were heavy drinkers, and the alcohol problem of the Victorian urban poor was real and devastating, well documented by contemporaries such as the journalist Henry Mayhew, the reformer William Booth of the Salvation Army, founded in 1865, and the novelist Arthur Morrison, whose Tales of Mean Streets in 1894 remains one of the bleakest portraits ever written of London's slums. The gin palace was a different animal again. Gin palaces were large, glittering establishments built in the 1820s, 1830s and 1840s with enormous plate-glass windows, gaslight, brass fittings and elaborate mirror-backed bars. They served spirits, mostly cheap gin, often at an astonishingly low price. Charles Dickens, writing in Sketches by Boz in the 1830s, described them as dazzling buildings that lured in the poor with a glitter that the actual drink never delivered. Many gin palaces became notorious as places where the gap between respectability and desperation was measured in a single glass. Temperance societies, which had been founded in Britain in the 1830s and grew steadily in strength throughout the century, campaigned against them, and by the 1890s, the gin palace as a distinct kind of establishment was fading, replaced by tighter licensing laws, more carefully regulated pubs, and a growing working-class preference for beer over spirits. The Band of Hope, a children's temperance movement founded in 1847 in Leeds by Anne Jane Carlyle, an Ulster widow, and the Reverend Jabez Tunnicliffe, signed up its youngest members at the age of 6. They pledged to abstain from alcohol, beer, and strong drink for life. By the end of the century, more than 3 million British children had signed the pledge, which, even allowing for the probability that a great many of them later quietly unsigned it over a pint of bitter, represents one of the largest civil movements of the Victorian age. Alongside the Band of Hope were the Rechabites, the Sons of Temperance, the Good Templars, and dozens of smaller local organisations, each with their own ribbons, banners and processions. Temperance parade through a northern English town on a sunny Saturday afternoon in 1885 could number several thousand marchers, all pledged, all singing, all heading for a large tent on a common where speeches would be given and tea would be drunk, very strong tea out of enormous enamel mugs. Historians still argue whether the temperance movement was a genuine reform campaign or a tool of middle-class control over the urban poor, and the most honest answer is that it was partly both, and that millions of the people who signed its pledges did so for their own reasons, mostly, and because they had watched their own fathers disappear into a gin, glass, and they wanted, quite plainly, a different life. Now for the last full chapter before we slow down into sleep, let us think about the Victorian household and its rules of time itself. You're back in Clifton, late at night on a Thursday in November 1882. The house is quiet, the front hall lamp is turned low, the servants are in bed, the master and mistress have gone up half an hour ago, the clocks of the house are ticking steadily, and there are, by last count, 11 of them on this floor alone, because Victorians loved clocks. There is a long case clock in the hall that has been in the family since 1798, made by a Bristol clockmaker called John Morgan, still keeping time within 2 minutes a week. There is a small ormolu mantel clock in the drawing room, French, bought by the mistress's father on a trip to Paris in 1855. There is a bracket clock in the dining room. There is a bedside clock in every bedroom, a kitchen clock near the range, a workshop clock in the outhouse, a carriage clock that travels when the master goes to visit his London office, and a tiny enamelled pocket clock kept by the young son under his pillow. Each of these clocks was, in any ordinary well-run Victorian household, wound on the same schedule, usually on a Sunday morning, usually by the master of the house or by the butler if he had one. Winding the clocks was itself a quiet small ritual. Many households had a dedicated clock key ring, hung in the butler's pantry, with labels identifying which key belonged to which clock. On Sunday mornings, before church, the owner would walk through the rooms, turn each key the prescribed number of times, check the hands and move on. A house where the clocks were out of synchrony was considered a house that had let something go. Historians still argue whether the Victorian obsession with timekeeping was a response to industrial change, to the railways, or to the influence of empire, but all three contributed. The railway timetable, in particular, had revolutionised British life in the 1840s and 1850s. Before the railways, each town kept its own local mean time set by the sun, so that when it was noon in London, it was 11:56 in Bristol and 12:04 in Norwich. Railway timetables needed a single standard, and in 1840 the Great Western Railway began running its trains on London time, with Bristol and other stations synchronising their station clocks to London. By 1880, Greenwich Mean Time was law throughout Britain. This standardisation of time touched every corner of Victorian social life. Breakfast was at 8, luncheon at 1, afternoon tea at 4, dinner at 7 or 8, depending on the class and the city. Appointments were made with exact times. Letters were dated with the hour as well as the day in many. Business households, omnibuses ran to timetables, ships sailed on the tide but also on the clock. The factory siren summoned workers to the mill at 5:30 in the morning, and it blew again at the end of each shift. A Victorian street in 1880 was a street filled with ticking, with the sound of clocks striking hours from towers and drawing rooms, and with the particular rhythm of a people who had, in just 2 generations, learned to organise themselves around minutes. The rules of time shaped visiting, dining, calling, mourning and courtship, as we have seen. They also shaped bed. The Victorian respectable bedtime, for adults, was somewhere between 10 and 11, earlier for servants, later for the most fashionable. Upstairs was a procession once the house had settled. The master went up with his candle, kissed his wife on the cheek at her dressing room door, walked down the corridor to his own dressing room, and undressed. His valet, if he had one, had laid out his night clothes and taken away the day's coat and boots. For cleaning, the mistress, in her dressing room, was helped by her lady's maid, if she had one, to undo the long row of small buttons at the back of her dress, to loosen her stays, to take out the pins from her hair, and to brush the hair with 100 strokes, a number that was traditional, not medical, but which many Victorian ladies counted aloud in silence all their lives. Then came the night clothes, flannel gowns for winter, cotton for summer, a nightcap for each. The fire was banked down, the gas, if fitted, was lowered to the merest glow. The curtains were drawn completely, because a Victorian bedroom was supposed to be dark, quiet and private. Prayers were often said by both husband and wife before sleeping, sometimes together, sometimes separately. And then at last, the lights were out, and the house was dark except for the faint red glow of the bedroom fires in their grates and the softly ticking clocks in every room. There was, of course, one final set of rules about what happened next, which we will not discuss at length here because this is a bedtime history, and bedtime itself requires gentleness. Suffice it to say that Victorian married life, too, had its routines, its silences and its carefully preserved privacies. Some couples shared a bed, some kept separate bedrooms, some had a dressing room between. The couple itself was, again, invisible to the rest of the house, and that invisibility was a shared courtesy of servants, children and neighbours. In a well-run Victorian home, the bedroom door closed at a particular hour, and nobody knocked. It is oddly lovely to think that, for all the strictness of the day, the last gesture of a Victorian bedtime was a gentle removal of oneself from the world, behind a closed door, in a room where, whatever the rules had demanded of one by day, one was finally free to be simply tired, and the ticking clocks downstairs went on, keeping the whole house marching quietly through the night, ready to begin at dawn another round of Victorian rules. That is the way the century kept itself together, not by force but by ritual, by routine, and by the quiet collective agreement of millions of people that this particular set of small daily rules was what a civilized life looked like. We have wandered tonight through Belgravia drawing rooms and Islington morning parlours, through Bond Street dressmakers and Brighton bathing machines, through the steam of Manchester mills and the soft gaslight of smoking rooms, and the quiet corners of parsonage libraries where women who never married ran, the charities of whole parishes. We have seen how Victorians folded their calling cards, how they shrouded their mirrors in black, how they named their chicken parts politely, and how slowly, over the long years between the accession of a young Queen in 1837 and her passing in 1901, a nation invented, enforced, softened, argued with, and finally outgrew a whole library of rules about how to sit, how to walk, how to eat, how to grieve, how to marry, how to sleep, and how to be seen or unseen by one's neighbours. What is gentle to hold on a quiet night is the realization that the rules were not, most of them, simply silly. They were earnest attempts, by people no less intelligent than we are, to make a sudden and confusing modern life livable. The railways had shrunk the country. The factories had scattered the old crafts. The cities had pulled millions off the land. Into that whirling newness, the Victorians reached for manners, and for duties, and for the small certainties of a calling card and an afternoon tea, as a way of saying, to themselves as much as to each other, we are still underneath everything, people of a shared world. Some of the rules were funny, some were cruel, some, like the mourning dress of a village widow holding her jet brooch, tightly in a cold church pew, were tender. All of them, taken together, were one of the great cultural experiments of the modern age. And the experiment, in its way, worked. It held the country together for 63 years. We have also seen, along the way, the small beginnings of the end. The bicycle that quietly dissolved the chaperone, the divided skirt that outwitted the etiquette manual, the female clerk arriving in the new clerical offices of 1895 with her own latchkey and her own opinions, the professional nurse whose uniform was a kind of armour, the unmarried aunt who wrote novels, the widow who, for the first time in her life, made her own decisions about where to spend her own evenings. Rules, patient and invisible though they seemed, were already being unpicked by the people they were meant to govern, and by the century's end, half of them were quietly gone. You have, I hope, enjoyed this slow stroll through their world. I have enjoyed telling it. If you have liked what you heard, and if you ever find yourself with a spare Sunday afternoon and the mood for a walk, try an old cemetery, read the stones. Look at the jet brooches and the orange blossom wreaths carved into marble. Notice the words beloved wife or only son or fell asleep in Jesus. Each of those stones is a little Victorian rulebook, carved gently in stone, waiting patiently for somebody to read it. The Victorians wanted to be remembered. They laid out in advance the rules for how to remember them. It is one of the kinder legacies of their age. Now let us begin, very gently, to let the day go. Settle your head a little more comfortably into the pillow. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of the blanket, the quiet warmth of the room, the soft hush of your own breath. Somewhere, in a house very much like this one, once a maid climbed the back stairs with a candle and a small jug of hot water, and she heard the long case clock in the hall strike 11, and she thought, only for a moment, of how tired she was, and how glad she would be to lie down. Imagine her now too, lying down. Imagine her blowing out her candle. Imagine the clock ticking on, soft and steady through the deep sleeping house. All around the fires are banked low, the curtains are drawn, the carriage has been put away in the mews, the horses rubbed down, the stable lantern turned out, the streets outside are hushed and cool, the gas lamps burning low in the fog. Even the policeman on his beat is walking slowly, his footsteps muffled, his helmet slightly bowed, as though he too were ready for sleep. Your own breathing is slowing now with the breathing of the house, each breath a little softer than the last, each thought a little quieter. The drawing rooms are empty, the dining table has been cleared, the tea tray has been carried down, all the small careful rules of the day are folded neatly away in their drawers, waiting patiently for the morning, which need not concern us just now. Let your eyelids, if they have not already, fall gently closed. Imagine the quiet of the Victorian night settling over you like a soft wool blanket, one stitch at a time. Listen, if you can still hear me, to the small distant tick of a clock that has been keeping time for 150 years. Let that tick be the last sound you notice. Let it fade slowly into the rhythm of your own pulse. Let it carry you now into sleep. Good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.